Hello, Doc Mario. Good morning.
Hi, Fab. Kamusta? Hi, Greg, Alan, Gio.
Morning, Mario.
Hi, Mar.
Morning.
Good
Hello.
morning po.
Maaga
Hi.
tayo. Good morning, Gio. Yeah.
Morning,
Fab,
Sir
meron ba
Mario.
tayong background na pwedeng i-share?
Ay, sige, gawa po ako. Wait po.
Salamat. Greg, pinadala ko din sa iyo yung yung gagamitin nating mga background slides. Sa pagpapakilala ng mga
Sige.
nagpagsalita
Sige.
para may giya din si Ricky tsaka ako. Nandoon
Okay,
yung
so-
mga bio notes din. So mababasa din ng mga manonood.
Okay. Papalitan ko ba yung aking background slide, Mar?
Pwedeng hindi.
Pwedeng hindi.
Ikaw, kung gusto mo, ipapadala ni
Hindi, okay na sa akin ito kung okay lang.
Okay naman, oo. Okay naman, oo.
Ako rin, Mar, hindi ko napapalitan dahil...
Okay lang. Salasal ba yung sa'yo, Alan?
Hindi. Nagugulo ako pag merong nagbabago masyado.
Okay.
At sabi sa'yo, hindi ako masyadong magaling pag masyado pang maaga sa... Pero sa inyo, ano na, no?
Mas
8 o'clock.
maaga dito ng
Ano
alas
oras?
7,
Alas-
7:10 dito. Diyan 8:10 ng umaga.
Oo. Nagkakape naman ako kaya okay naman ako.
science and technology and innovation, these are indispensable in the modern economy, in the modern world.
The meeting at the MSI, and we resolved among about 6 to 8 of us, local members, first to form PAASE Philippines so that we could continue to host meetings here, but also to go on a massive campaign to try to get support from the national government through the legislative and executive branches to invest more in science and technology. So it started with a white paper, a position paper that we co-authored among 6 of us, namely Ernie Pernia, Cesar Saloma, Redora Asanza, Toby Dairita Fataneo, and Aling de la Salle, and myself.
So PAASE historically, in the past 10, 20 years for sure, have been collaborating with our counterparts here in the Philippines at various universities. And a lot of these interactions probably started as peer-to-peer. But thankfully, we have the Department of Science and Technology here in the Philippines, and they've come up with some really helpful and very impactful programs that actually enable PAASE members that are based in the United States and other parts of the world to actually come here and do extensive research and academic partnerships and collaborations.
Well, I think that one of the good things that PAASE is doing is really trying to stay in touch with the researchers and the scientists here in the Philippines. So I think that is one of the good programs that they keep on supporting some of the initiatives of our researchers and scientists here in the country, trying to align also their assistance towards the plans of the Philippine government.
It's very important that the PAASE members and scientists based in the Philippines are continuously in contact, so we will know the needs of the Filipinos and opportunities that Filipinos can have to do science with their PAASE counterparts. So these interactions, such as the conference that we're holding and the annual conferences that we have.
The Philippines and the scientists there have very unique perspective that adds to discoveries and inventions, advancing in general the field.
These members, because they are part of an academy, it implies that they are productive. So they have publications, they have innovations, they have inventions, patents, and they have, they have an impact on society. Okay, so these are the people who can convince government, invest more in science and technology, and that was really the gist of our paper, our position paper in 2000. And it is Ernie Pernia who said that R&D by nature is expensive and it is a public good. So it is important for the government to take the lead in investing in R&D.
To increase the economic growth potential of the country, we cannot continue to just rely on traditional inputs into production as capital and labor. We also need to develop our expertise in science and technology and innovation so that we can come up with new systems, new ways of doing things.
I think that science, researchers, industry, and even the government is really like an ecosystem of knowledge. So I think it doesn't really matter if you're coming from a private institution or a public institution, such as a state university. I think we all have a role to play to improve the research capabilities and scientific knowledge here in the country. I think it is about time for us to realize that one of our roles as academics, as researchers, as scientists, is to actually contribute to that global body of knowledge.
And the role of this cooperation among these government agencies really is to be able to attract science and technology, global-based companies to set up shop here. And that is really key in terms of developing the science and technology innovation ecosystem in the country.
Particularly because there's that deep desire. And what PAASE does and can do more of is to promote this relationship between its members.
We really need to ratchet up the appreciation, the recognition of the importance of science and technology and innovation.
And we are all trying to attain what we call the common good, the greater, higher, long-term good of the Filipino people.
Science and technology and innovation, these are indispensable in the modern economy, in the modern world.
We held a meeting at the MSI, and we resolved among about 6 to 8 of us, local members, first to form PAASE Philippines so that we could continue to host meetings here, but also to go on a massive campaign to try to get support from the national government through the legislative and executive branches to invest more in science and technology. So it started with a white paper, a position paper that we co-authored among 6 of us, namely Ernie Pernia, Cesar Saloma, Rador Asansa, Toby Dairita Fataneo, and Aling de la Salle, and myself.
So PAASE historically, in the past 10, 20 years for sure, have been collaborating with our counterparts here in the Philippines at various universities. And a lot of these interactions probably started as peer-to-peer. But thankfully, we have the Department of Science and Technology here in the Philippines, and they've come up with some really helpful and very impactful programs that actually enable PAASE members that are based in the United States and other parts of the world to actually come here and do extensive research and academic partnerships and collaborations.
Well, I think that one of the good things that PAASE is doing is really trying to stay in touch with the researchers and the scientists here in the Philippines. So I think that is one of the good programs that they keep on supporting some of the initiatives of our researchers and scientists here in the country, trying to align also their assistance towards the plans of the Philippine government.
It's very important that the PAASE members and scientists based in the Philippines are continuously in contact, so we will know the needs of the Filipinos and opportunities that Filipinos can have to do science with their PAASE counterparts. So these interactions, such as the conference that we're holding and the annual conferences that we have.
The Philippines and the scientists there have very unique perspective that adds to discoveries and inventions, advancing in general the field.
These members, because they are part of an academy, it implies that they are productive. So they have publications, they have innovations, they have inventions, patents, and they have, they have an impact on society. Okay, so these are the people who can convince government, invest more in science and technology, and that was really the gist of our paper, our position paper in 2000. And it is Ernie Pernia who said that R&D by nature is expensive and it is a public good. So it is important for the government to take the lead in investing in R&D.
To increase the economic growth potential of the country, we cannot continue to just rely on traditional inputs into production as capital and labor. We also need to develop our expertise in science and technology and innovation so that we can come up with new systems, new ways of doing things.
I think that science, researchers, industry, and even the government is really like an ecosystem of knowledge. So I think it doesn't really matter if you're coming from a private institution or a public institution, such as a state university. I think we all have a role to play to improve the research capabilities and scientific knowledge here in the country. I think it is about time for us to realize that one of our roles as academics, as researchers, as scientists, is to actually contribute to that global body of knowledge.
And the role of this cooperation among these government agencies really is to be able to attract science and technology, global-based companies to set up shop here. And that is really key in terms of developing the science and technology innovation ecosystem in the country.
Particularly because there's that deep desire. And what PAASE does and can do more of is to promote this relationship between its members.
We really need to ratchet up the appreciation, the recognition of the importance of science and technology and innovation.
And we are all trying to attain what we call the common good, the greater, higher, long-term good of the Filipino people.
Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Ako po si Mario Santo Domingo. I'm the president of the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering. And I would like to welcome everyone to the last fireside chat of the year of PAASE. PAASE is an organization of, by my last count, more than 600 scientists and engineers based in the US, Canada, and of course in the Philippines and in many countries around the world. It's a global organization. More than 1/3 of the members are based here in the US and in Canada and other countries like in Australia, Singapore, and so on and so forth. We have right now about 390 members based in the Philippines. We are really very grateful for everyone, to everyone for coming this morning. I know it's a holiday, so maraming salamat po. I have with me this morning as co-moderator Dr. Ricardo Nolasco. Ricky, nandito ka na ba? Dr. Ricky Nolasco is a retired professor from the Department of Linguistics of the University of the Philippines. How did this idea to have a fireside chat on language of instruction in science and mathematics come about? It started early in the year when I invited Dr. Greg Del Pilar, the current president of NRCP, the National Research Council of the Philippines, to be part of our pro-science activism roundtable discussions, in March. Unfortunately, he was not available then, but we thought that perhaps, this year, and it's happening now, we will do a fireside chat on this very important issue. So I actually probably just like many of you have limited understanding. Oh, probably only a few of us, probably many of you here are very much familiar already with the MTB MLE. What I did was to Google, what it is, and I'm very sure that our speakers will shine more light, on this particular area. Trev, can you show that product of my simple research? I tried to know what MTB MLE policy is, and according to one paper published online by the ACTR Center, which is, I understand, based at CIDS in UP. The mother tongue-based multilingual education policy in the Philippines involved the implementation of the local mother tongues as the language of instruction in K2 year 3, with official languages, Filipino and English, being introduced as the language of instruction after grade 3. So we know that previously Filipino and English were used as the language of instruction, with local languages used to assist the teachers and students in the classroom. I just don't know whether everything on the last part of this paragraph is still true. While a very small number of schools previously implemented MTB MLE, many schools and teachers are now learning how to use a local mother tongue as the language of instruction, and in the coming years, this will be taken up by more schools teaching a wider variety of languages. Ricky, meron ka ba idadagdag? Do you have any addition to this background on MTB MLE?
Ay, magandang umaga, Mar. Nice to see you again after a long time, no? Hindi, tama yung yung nakalagay dito sa slide na ito, no? But you know, there are challenges in implementing mother tongue-based multilingual education. No? I think the first problem confronting implementers, no, is the concept itself of L1-based MLE. No, there is this concept or the belief that L1-based MLE can only be implemented during the first 3 years. No, that's not quite correct. No, because under the law, what is provided for is what we call a no exit policy. No, L1-based MLE becomes the primary medium of instruction throughout the elementary grades, while the L2s, namely Filipino and English for most Filipinos, are the primary medium of instruction. No, siguro ganun na muna. I think we have to hear from our speakers. No, magandang umaga sa inyong lahat.
Magandang umaga muli, Ricky. Without further ado, let me introduce our first esteemed speaker for this morning's Fireside Chat. He's none other than Dr. Greg Del Pilar. Dr. Del Pilar founded and was the first to head the Personality and Individual Differences Lab at the UP Diliman. He handled courses in personality traits, personality and ability measurement, and psychological statistics as professor of psychology until his retirement in 2020 as a professorial lecturer since then. He has been consultant for major tests of the Civil Service Commission and the Career Executive Service Board and the Philippine Coast Guard. He's on executive board of the World Association for Personality Psychology and is a fellow of the Pambansang Samahan sa Psikolohiyang Pilipino and the Psychological Association of the Philippines. The main author of the Mapa ng Loob, a personality inventory that operationalizes the breakthrough 5-factor model of personality traits with Filipino trait constructs. He has held the UP Alumni in Wisconsin Diamond Jubilee Professorial Chair and has been awarded several UP International Publication Awards and UP Centennial and Diamond Jubilee faculty grants. Dr. Del Pilar was president of the NRCP, the National Research Council of the Philippines, from 2020 until this year. He obtained his AB Psych from UP Diliman and his doctorate in differential psychology from the University of Paris, Nanterre. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Greg?
Okay. Salamat, Mar. Magandang umaga po sa lahat. Natutuwa po akong humarap sa inyo ngayong umaga. Meron po akong marami akong mga kaibigan dito sa PAASE. Gusto ko silang batiin. At maya-maya darating din siguro yung mga kasama ko sa Mother Tongue-Based Multilingual Education Discussion Group ng NRCP at ilang mga kasama ko sa NRCP ay malamang darating din. Maganda po ito, a fireside chat po itong ating ating pagtitipon ngayong umaga. Ibig sabihin tayo ay naghuhuntahan, nag-uusapan ng relax, no? Pero ang totoo niyan po marami kaming i-share ni Dayan, kaya medyo dapat balanse, no, na paspasan ko pero relax din dapat. Teka ha. So share screen. Yun. Ito. So ito pong aking paghahayag ngayong umaga ay nakabatay sa isang revista na aking ginawa. Matagal na, 1990 pa, no? Ingles o mga wikang Pilipino bilang medium ng pagtuturo, isang revista ng mga empirical na pag-aaral. Binasa ko ito sa isang seminar, no? Pambansang seminar ng Pambansang Samahan sa Psikolohiya ng Bata sa Philippine Normal College noong 1990. At isinumiti ko rin ito sa Sentro ng Wikang Filipino noong 1991. Hindi ko ito napalathala dahil sa paalis ako papuntang Pransya noong 1991, kaya hindi na nagkaroon ng panahon. Pero ito po ay sa pag-uudyok, no, ng aking mga kasama sa sa discussion group namin, napag-usapan namin na ipalalathala ito. So lalabas ito sa Mabini Journal ng Polytechnic University of the Philippines. At in-encourage nila ako, no, na ibahagi ko ito sa mga siyentipikong pagtitipon, at ito ang ikalawang pagkakataon para sa akin na ibahagi ito sa mga mananaliksik at siyentista. Okay, ito pong aking revista ay merong isang sinakop nito ang 16 na pag-aaral na ilathala o nakabind sa mga aklatan na may buong ulat ng pag-aaral, kasama ang mga detalye ng metodo at kinasapitan. Kinalap ang mga pag-aaral mula sa UP Main Library, UP Education Library, pambansang aklatan, mga aklatan ng DEX, ng PNU at ng pamantasang sentro eskolar. Nung panahong iyon, kailangan maglakbay ka talaga sa Maynila para gumawa ng ganitong klase ng research. Hindi pwedeng internet lang. 3 ay malakihang pag-aaral na tumagal ng ilang taon o kaya ay sumakop sa malaking bahagi ng bansa. 5 ang disertasyong pang-doktorado, 5 ang thesis pang-masterado, at 3 ang ulat ng pananaliksik para sa mga titulong masterado. Ito po ang unang bahagi, itong pangunahing bahagi ng revista. Meron akong pangalawang bahagi na tatalakayin ko rin kung meron tayong panahon mamaya. Okay. Ang batayang istruktura ng mga pag-aaral ay ganito, no? Simple lang, no? Very straightforward. Experimental o quasi-experimental ang pamamaraan. Ang ibig sabihin po noon, at tulad ng alam natin, kapag experimental ang ating pag-aaral, ang mananaliksik ang bumubuo ng grupo, no? At karaniwan ito ay sa pamamagitan ng random assignment, no? Ito ay para ang random assignment, ang pinakamahusay, hindi naman, meron pang mas mahusay doon, pero ang random assignment, ang ginagawa nito, tulad siguro ng alam natin, hinahati nito, no? Mataas ang probability na mahahati natin ng mahusay yung mga ibang extraneous variables na maaring makaapekto sa ating gustong pag-aralan, no? So yung motivation, yung kayaan, yung mga dating nalalaman, ito ay 50-50 ang pinaka-likely na nahahati mo yan dun sa 2 grupo. Kaya bago mo gawin yung iyong eksperimento, magkapantay ang iyong 2 grupo sa yun ang inaasahan natin na ginagawa ng random assignment, no? Doon sa mahahalagang variables na hindi nating interest pero pwedeng makaapekto sa ating dependent variable. Ang quasi-experimental naman, ito ay pareho silang, ang pakay nito ay makabuo ng mga sanhiin ng mga statements, no? Causal statements, no? Statements of cause and effect. Pero ang quasi-experiment ay maaring intact groups ang pinag-aaralan, no? Pero ang ginagawa dito, ipinakikita ng mananaliksik na pare-pareho yung mga tao, yung mga kalahok, no? Sa experimental at sa control group doon sa mga extraneous variables. Okay. So basically ganito, no? Isang grupo tinuruan sa Pilipino o isang wikang Pilipino at ang kabilang grupo ay sa Ingles. Tapos matapos ang isang takdang panahon, magbibigay ng panukat ng bisa ng pagtuturo ng wikang Panturo, at sa karamihan ng pag-aaral sa 12, ito ay ang isang panukat ng natutunan, no? So in 75% of the studies, the measure of the dependent variable was a measure of what the students had learned, no? But in 4 studies, ang ginamit na panukat ng bisa ay isang indise ng epektibong gamit ng wika sa pagtuturo at pakikipagtalakayan sa classroom. No, actually hindi isang indise pero marami to, pero pinagsama-sama nila. Mamaya makikita natin hopefully yung kabuuan, no? Okay. Maliban sa random assignment, no, para pagtumbasin ang 2 grupo, meron pang kumbaga mas stricto o mas epektibong pamamaraan ng pagpapantay ng dalawang grupo, at ito ay sa pamamagitan ng paris-paris na pagtutumbas ng mga kalahok ayon sa kasarian, edad, IQ, at bilang ng mga araw ng pumasok sa klase. Ito yung aktual na ginamit nung dalawang malalaking pag-aaral at ng isang disertasyon, no? So susukatin mo muna sila dun sa mga extraneous variables, tapos pagpaparis-parisin mo at saka mo hahatiin at random, no? So lalo ka pang mas sigurado no na talagang magpapantay yung dalawang grupo mo dun sa iyong mga extraneous variables. Gumamit din ng pagtutumbas ng mga katangian ng mga guro, no? So yung kanilang kwalipikasyong pang-edukasyon, bilang ng taong nagtuturo, yung kanilang kahusayan, pinagpantay din yan. Dun sa malalaking pag-aaral, no? At saka sa isang disertasyon. Gumamit ang ibang mga pag-aaral ng random assignment ng mga kalahok, yung sinabi ko kanina, o kaya ng random assignment ng mga klase. At ipinakita na magkapantay ang mean ng dalawang grupo sa IQ o sa isang pretest. O kaya gumamit ng analysis of covariance, yung isang pag-aaral, para tanggalin ang epekto ng mga salik na nabanggit, no? Batay sa mga ulat, batid ng mga mananaliksik ang pangangailangan na magkapantay ang kakayahan ng guro sa dalawang grupo at walang ipakitang pagkiling sa alinmang wika. Yung mas maliliit na mga pag-aaral, yung mga dissertation, yung mga master's thesis, yung mismong mananaliksik ang nagtuturo, no?
Hello, Dayan.
Dalawang klase.
Hello, Dayan. Have you found the link? I sent you to, you have to just register. Okay, and it's going to give you.
Okay. So, ayun, tiniyak nila na yung kanilang pagharap sa klase ay magkapareho dun sa dalawa, dun sa tinuturuan nila ng Pilipino at tinuturuan nila gamit ang Ingles, no, na pareho ang kanilang sigla, ang kanilang kahusayan, no? Tapos, meron ding pagtatangkang pagpantayin ang dalawang grupo sa mga ibang kondisyong pagturo, tulad ng kondisyon ng classroom, yung schedule, no? Hindi dapat napakaaga ng iba, dapat regular na schedule lang lahat, at mga babasahin, no? Importante yon dahil makikita natin mamaya na dyan sa mga babasahin nagkaroon ng kaunting problema. Hindi kaunti, medyo malaki. Okay. Yung 16 na pag-aaral, kung titingnan natin, ito yung unang 8, no? Simula doon sa pag-aaral ni Aguilar, 1953, medyo kilala ito, no? Sa Iloilo. Tapos yung Bureau of Public School Study at yung pag-aaral na iniulat ni Davis noong 1967, ito yung malalaking mga pag-aaral na iuulat ko mamaya ng medyo detalyado. Pagkatapos, merong 4 na disertasyon na magkakaugnay, yung kay Mogol, Tuy, Santos at Esclabanan. Okay, at ang tingnan natin ngayon ay yung mga grado, no? Makikita natin dun sa second column na iba-ibang grado ito, nasasakop yung iba-ibang grado mula grade 1 hanggang first year high school. Sa katunayan, ang asignatura ay reading, arithmetic, social studies, language. Tapos, dun sa pag-aaral ni Davis, pangatlo, arithmetic computation at arithmetic word problems, pinaghiwalay, no? Health and science, yan. Tapos, ano ang wikang itinapat sa Ingles? Actually, Pilipino lang at Filipino, maliban sa Hiligaynon. Ang naiiba yung Hiligaynon, yung unang-unang pag-aaral, no? Pero yung wika ng mga kalahok ay makikita natin dito, iba-iba, no? Hiligaynon, Ilocano, Bicol, Cebuano, Tagalog. No? Doon naman sa pangalawang grupo, pangalawa dahil hindi lang magkasya sa aking slide, pero ito makikita natin dito yung actually ang chronological ang ayos nito, pero makikita rin natin na mula sa elementary grades nag-shift yung research, no, sa high school, no? So pinag-aralan na ang high school, lahat ng year levels nakikita natin diyan. Kasama pa ang kolehiyo. Meron tayong isang pag-aaral, yung kay Ciceron, na first year college ang mga participants, no, mga estudyante sa physics. At makikita rin natin dito ang iba't ibang asignatura, advanced arithmetic, geometry, chemistry, algebra, advanced algebra, at biology at physics, no. Tapos ang mga wika ng mga kalahok, nadagdag ang Antikenyo at Kapampangan. Okay, ano ang kinasapitan ng mga pag-aaral? Tatalakayin ko yung tatlong pinakamalalaking, apat actually, no, kasama yung disertasyon. Alright. Itong pag-aaral ni Aguilar sa Iloilo, longitudinal, no? Sinundan ng mga bata mula grade 1 at grade 2. At dito nakikita ninyo na yung trend, no? 27.72 versus 36, 27 versus 29, 9 versus 14. Ito ay Ingles tapos Filipino, 22 versus 31, 34 versus 43, 26 versus 38, 24 versus 41, grade 2 language. Laging lamang ang Hiligaynon, no? At ang katunayan, kung titingnan natin ang statistical significant, lahat nito ay significant at 0.01, no? Yung nakapula, lahat ng nakapula, yung itim hindi significant, no? Hindi umabot sa 0.05, no? Pero yung lahat ng iba 0.01. Okay. Tumungo naman tayo sa pag-aaral ng Bureau of Public Schools noong 1960. Ito ay cross-sectional, no? Ginawa ito noong 1956, isang taong ginawa, 1956. At mahalaga itong pag-aaral na ito, makikita natin malalaki ang sample size nila dahil ginawa ito sa 5 rehiyong di Tagalog, no? So parang ang nangyari, tinitingnan nila kung yung mga bata na ang sinasalita ibang wikang Pilipino ay mas magiging epektibo pa rin sa kanila ang Pilipino kung ihahambing sa Ingles, no? Ano-ano itong mga lugar na pinag-aralan? Albay, Sorsogon, Ilocos, Cebu at Negros Oriental, no? So grade 3, 4 and 5 sa reading, arithmetic, social studies at language, at makikita natin parehong trend, no? 33 versus 38, 29 versus 36, 38 versus 43, 49 versus 62 sa grade 3. Tapos tingnan lang natin ang grade 5, no? 62 versus 88, 27 versus 34, 41, 59, 73, 113. Parang lumaki pa ang agwat, no? At kung titingnan natin ang statistical significance, lahat sila significant. Yung nakapula 0.01 at yung itim 0.05. Okay. Tumungo naman tayo ngayon sa pag-aaral sa Rizal kay Davis. Ang nag-ulat nito ay si Davis, no, sa isang libro noong 1967. Ito ay ang pag-aaral sa Rizal ay tulad na makikita natin, maraming pagkakaiba dun sa mga iba, no? Unang-una, 6 na taon ang itinagal nitong pag-aaral na to. Sinundan ang mga bata mula grade 1 hanggang grade 6. 3 ang grupo. Yung unang grupo, tawagin natin silang 1, 2, and 3. No? Yung unang grupo, Pilipino ang ginamit mula grade 1 hanggang grade 4. Yung pangalawa, Pilipino nung 2 unang taon at Ingles noong grade 3 at grade 4. At yung pangatlong grupo naman ay Ingles ang ginamit mula grade 1. Pagdating noong grade 4, sinukat sila, no, sa mga subject matter tests, okay? Natitingnan natin maya-maya. Pagkatapos, pagdating ng grade 5, lahat sila English na, ang wikang Panturo. At pagdating ng grade 6, pagkatapos ng grade 6, meron ulit pagsukat ng natutunan. Okay. Isinama ko ito sa aking rebista dahil parang paano, pwedeng ipaghambing yung Pilipino na, by the way, actually mas komplikado pa yung kanilang design dahil ang nangyari, yung bawat grupo nung susukatin na ang kanilang natutunan, hinati pa sa 3 ang bawat grupo, no? Yung isang grupo sinukat o nag-test sa Pilipino, yung isa nag-test sa Ingles, at yung isa bilingual yung kanilang test, no? Magkatabi yung Ingles at Pilipino na mga items, no? So pero ang yon, mamaya ipaliliwanag ko kung paano ko ihahayag yung datos dito. All right. Now kung iisipin natin, no, yung mga ibang pag-aaral dito sa revista, ang pakay nila talaga ay ipakita na mas mabisa yung wikang Pilipino kaysa sa Ingles, no? Kung naman ito no, napaka-rational nitong hypothesis na ito, hindi ba? Na napaka-intuitive, no? Itong ganitong hypothesis. At yung hindi komplikadong problema itong pinag-aaralan dito, napakasimple. Actually, ang kanilang pakay ay hindi talaga investigation, no? Ang ultimate kung ang gusto talagang nilang gawin ay ipakita, i-demonstrate, no? I-demonstrate yung sinasabi sa atin ng ating katwiran na dapat na dapat mangyari. Yung wikang mas alam ng bata, yung wikang mas malapit sa sinasalita ng bata, ang dapat na mas epektibo sa kanyang pagkatuto, no? Mas mabilis, mas episyente yung kanyang pagkatuto tungkol dito. Ngayon, mahalaga ring sabihin na yung mga pag-aaral sa revista, tulad ng sinabi ko, iningatan nila yung kanilang metodolohiya, no? Kasi alam nila na kapag hindi maingat yung metodolohiya nila, walang papansin sa kanilang pag-aaral. Meron sila talagang gustong ipakita, no? Kaya yung pagpapantay ng mga grupo, yung pagpapantay ng mga kalahok, maingat itong ginawa, no? Dun sa pangkabuuan, no? Dun sa iba't ibang mga pag-aaral. Pero itong pag-aaral ni Davis, itong pag-aaral sa Rizal, ibang-iba ang pakay, no? Ang pondo nito ay nanggaling sa Rockefeller Foundation na binigay sa University of California, UCLA, na siyang nagbuo ng eksperimento, no? Nagsimula ito noong 1957 at malinaw na ang nung panahong iyon, actually nasa reports naman nila ito, na panahon yon na parang matunog yung teaching English as a second language, no, TESL. At ang UCLA ang isang namumuno ron. Baka sila pa nga nag-imbento nun. But in any case, yun ang kanilang interes, ano, yung nung lumapit sa kanila ang ilang mga Philippine educators, no, naisip nila na itong magandang proyekto ito, nakatuon talaga sila sa Ingles, no, na gusto nilang makita. Actually, mahalagang banggitin, no? At ito ay natuklasan ko lang noong binalikan ko yung libro ni Davis, no? At tinignan ko, ano nga ba ang pakay nitong pag-aaral na ito? Makikita natin ito sa page 3. Ayan, nakikita ninyo, to find out the relative effectiveness of introducing English as the medium of instruction at 3 different points in the elementary grades, no? Sa madaling salita, titingnan kung saan mas matututo ang mga bata sa subject matter content kung ipapasok ang Ingles, simulang gagamitin bilang medium ng pagtuturo sa grade 1 dito sa grupo na to, sa grade 3 dito, at sa grade 5, no, doon sa grupo na Pilipino ang gamit mula grade 1 to grade 4. Mahalagang isaalang-alang itong pakay na ito para maintindihan natin kung bakit. Kasi kung titingnan mo lang na ito, ang pakay nito parang yung mga iba lang na pag-aaral, no, na gustong ipakita ang superiority ng Pilipino sa pamamagitan na ang tamang experimental procedure, maunawaan natin kasi nga pinagpantay ng husto, no, doon sa mga pag-aaral na yun, yung kondisyon ng dalawang grupo. Magugulat tayo na dito sa ulat na ito, yung atensyon na binigay sa Ingles, sa pagtuturo ng Ingles ay napakalaki, no? Parang walang control doon. Halos hindi pinansin yung pagtuturo ng Pilipino, walang ginawa doon. Pero tingnan ninyo itong ginawa para sa pagtuturo ng Ingles. Kinopya ko ito dahil mahirap paniwalaan, ano? Pages 25 to 26. Grade 1 and 2 teachers, 10-day seminar with demonstrations and discussions of the methods to be employed in teaching English as a second language. Grade 3 and 4 teachers, a regular 8-week summer session undergraduate course on the teaching of English as a second language at the Philippine Normal College, free tuition, academic credit given by PNC, free manuals and textbooks. Grade 5, 6-week seminar. Grade 6, 4-week training course. Sa summer ginagawa. Tapos pakinggan nyo itong dalawang huli. Monthly conferences throughout the school year where demonstrations of methods for English second language teaching were held and problems were discussed. At allowance for expenses in attending the summer sessions and the monthly conferences. So, kapag babasahin mo yung babasahin mo yung mga ulat, no? Kasi ito yung pakay ng pag-aaral, no? Pero tulad nga ng sabi ko, pwede mo ring tingnan kung tingnan mo yung ginawa nila sa grade 1 to grade 4 na para siyang pag-aaral, tinitingnan kung alin ang mas mabisang wikang Panturo. Sa madaling salita, parang yung ibang mga pag-aaral, no? Pero yun nga, bali makikita natin na dahil dun sa napakalaking tuon, no, atensyon na binigay sa pag-aaral ng Ingles, merong mga nagsasabi, no, halimbawa si Bonifacio Sibayan, pinansin niya na parang daw, no, yun nga, greater attention, pinansin niya yon doon sa training ng teachers at sa mga materials, no. Binanggit din ito ni Jose Aguilar, binanggit din ito mismo ni Clifford Praetor. Si Praetor yung nagsulat ng foreword doon sa libro ni libro ni Davis, no. So merong mga ganong pagpapansin kasi hindi mo talaga maiiwasan, magugulat ka, bakit ganito, no. Anyway, so epektibo itong epektibo, tingnan natin ang resulta. Sa grade 4, sinimplihan ko ang paghahayag ng resulta, no. Ito ito yung kanilang score nung Filipino group dun sa panukat na Pilipino, at ito naman yung score nung grupo ng tinuruan sa Ingles dun sa panukat sa Ingles. Okay, so mas mataas yung grupong tinuruan sa Ingles, no? Sa social studies, sa health and science, arithmetic computation, pero sa arithmetic word problems, mas mataas ng kaunti yung tinuruan sa Pilipino. Ang tansya ko, merong mga hindi diretsyon tinest ito, no? Iba kasi yung method analysis of covariance dun sa 3 grupo ang ginawa, pero merong mga standard deviations doon, at tinest ko gamit yung standard deviation. Significant itong social studies at yung arithmetic computation, pero itong dalawa hindi. Okay. Pagdating sa grade 6. So, grade 6, ibig sabihin nag-shift na lahat sa Ingles, no? Malaki na ang lamang ng grupong tinuruan ng Ingles. Tingnan lang muna natin itong versus itong first group sa Pilipino, tinuruan sa Pilipino, 42 versus 46, 32 versus 40, 12 versus 16 at 12 versus 20. Okay. So, yung atensyon na ibinigay sa Ingles nagbunga, no, dito sa eksperimentong ito. Pero bago natin ito iwanan, gusto ko lang ipakita sa inyo o tawagin ng inyong pansin dito sa resulta para sa mga gumamit ng Ingles ng 4 na taon. Ayon kay Praetor, no, dun sa nagsulat ng foreword, ito ang pinaka nakapagtatakang resulta. Kasi ang akala nila, habang mas matagal mong ginagamit ang Ingles bilang wikang Panturo, mas marami kang naintindihan, no? Kaya ang kanilang inaasahan o ang expectation nila, mas ito ang papangalawa dito sa grupo na to. Pero ang lumabas, pinakamababa siya sa 3, no? Dito lang siya mas mataas dito sa grupo na nagsimula matuto o gamitin ng Ingles ng grade 5, no? So, hindi pala totoo, no? Takantaka sila rito at hindi nila naipaliwanag, no, kung bakit ito na bagamat 4 na taon ang panahon sa paggamit ng Ingles bilang wikang panturo ay hindi mas mataas, mas maraming natutunan. Pero actually, merong paliwanag dito na siguro si Dayan ang magbabanggit mamaya na may kinalaman sa tagal ng panahon na dapat mong gamitin yung wika ng bata, no, para ito maging mas epektibo. Pero dito nakikita na natin na kapag 4 na taon, mas okay ang kanyang resulta kung ihahambing dun sa mga bata na 2 taon lang nag-Pilipino. Actually, hindi pa rin sapat yung 4 na taon tulad nung babanggitin ni Dayan mamaya. Okay. Tumungo naman tayo ngayon sa... Okay. Ito yung resulta sa grade 4 na nakita na natin. Ano? Tumungo naman tayo ngayon dun sa dissertation, ano tawag doon? Ano? 4 silang magkakaugnay na disertasyon ginawa sa UP College of Education. Pinag-aralan ang gamit ng wika sa classroom sa mga klase ng Agham at Araling Panlipunan, sa Katagalugan at Kabikulan, no, at sa grades 1, 3, 5 at first year high school. So doon sila naghati-hati, ano, yung 4, si Mogol, Tuy, Santos at Esclabanan, yung isa sa grade 1, yung isa sa grade 3, etc. Ang independent variables nila bale yung subject, yung region at yung language, yun ang primary, no. Sasabihin ko na ngayon na wala silang nakitang pagkakaiba sa pagitan ng Katagalugan at Kabikulan tulad ng makikita ninyo, no, maya-maya. Okay, ano yung kanilang mga indise, no? Actually, siyam ang indise, no? Tingnan natin yung ilan sa kanila. Yung unang 6, ito yung tinatawag nilang positive indices at yung iba 7 to 9, yun yung negative indices, no? Tingnan natin yung una, pedagogical phases completed. Ang kanilang method, ang kanilang pamamaraan, nag-tape sila ng 30-minute segment, no, ng klase 2 beses. Tapos yun ang ni-rate ng mga researchers. Ang pedagogical phases completed, ito yung kapag nagtuturo, kasi para sa bawat konsepto na ipapasok ng teacher, dumadaan siya sa 5 yugto, no, ng pagtatalakay dun sa paksa. Preparation, assertion, interpretation, justification, tapos application. Kung maganda ang daloy ng klase, marami kang konseptong matatapos, hindi ba? So, yan ang isang palatandaan ng isang panukat ng pagka-epektibo ng wikang ginagamit mo sa classroom. Ngayon, yung level of pedagogical moves naman, sa loob ng isang pedagogical phase, merong ito yung actual na ginagawa ng teacher, no, sa anong ginagawa niya? Structuring, soliciting, responding, sasagot yung bata, tapos magre-react yung teacher. Yun ang pedagogical moves. Level, tinitingnan nila kung tama yung sagot o hindi, no? So hindi, para sa teacher ito, no. Ibig sabihin kung yung kanyang soliciting ba halimbawa ay what is the capital of Finland, low level yon, ano? Pero kung sasabihin niya paano nagsimula na buo ang syudad ng Helsinki, etc., mas mataas na yon, ano, na paanyaya o soliciting yon. Yung level of thinking naman, hanggang dito na lang ako para sa positive. Yung level of thinking, simple lang ito kung tama o mali yung sagot ng bata, no? Anyway, so yung 6 yan, tapos yun namang negative. Cueing, inaayudahan ba ng teacher yung bata para makasagot? Yung shifting, alam natin yan, code switching, no? Pag naubusan sa isang wika, mag-shift sa kabila. At miscommunication. So, challenge ipakita ang resulta nito dahil ang dami-daming resulta nito, no? Katagalugan at Kabikulan. So, but anyway, kayang-kaya nyo ito. Ayan. So, ganyan ang makikita natin. Paghihiwalayin ko yung Araling Panlipunan at Agham, pero makikita ninyo na dala-dalawa ang entry sa cells dahil yun ay para sa Katagalugan at Kabikulan. Ipapakita ko kung aling wika ang nakalalamang, no? Filipino ba? F o Ingles? I. Okay. So ito yung ito yung resulta. Makikita natin na sa grade 1, no, sa Katagalugan at sa Kabikulan, Filipino ang nakalalamang. Maliban sa dalawang sa Katagalugan, fluency of pupil high response at clarity and fluency of classroom interaction. Ibig sabihin yan, kapag dash, pantay lang, walang nakahihigit. Pero maliban doon, sa lahat ng grado, lahat ng year levels, at sa lahat sa Kabikulan man o Katagalugan, ang Filipino ang nakalalamang sa araling pantipunan. Pag tumungo naman tayo sa Agham, ibang-ibang itsura, no? Puro dash, pantay lahat. Sa katunayan, ang konklusyon ng mga may akda ay sa Agham, hindi mahalaga, parang walang masyadong epekto yung wikang ginagamit mo, no? Kung titingnan natin, nakalalamang ang Filipino ng kaunti dahil 8 ang kanilang lamang, 4 ang lamang ng Ingles, no? Okay. Pero tama kaya yung ganong konklusyon na hindi ganong kahalaga ang wika sa classroom discussion? Maaari. Pero tingnan natin ito, no? Ito ang resulta sa grade 1 at typical ito, no? Typical ito dun sa mga resulta sa ibang mga indice at ibang mga grado. Sa araling panlipunan, kasi bali in 30 minutes, ang expectation nila, makakatapos ka ng 10 pedagogical, makakakumpleto ka ng 10 concepts. No? Madadaanan mo yung pedagogical phases ng 10 concepts. Ang nakumpleto na pedagogical phases ng Filipino, 8, ang hindi nakumpleto, 2. Ang English, kitang-kita nyo yung contrast, no? Isa lang ang nakumpleto in 30 minutes. Isang konsepto lang ang natapos nila, no? Pero sa Agham, ganito ang resulta, pantay, walang mas nakahihigit, parehong hindi nakukumpleto sa Agham, no? So, ngayon paano kung pareho sila, walang nakalalamang pero epektibo yung gamit ng wika, ganito ang magiging resulta, di ba? Maraming makukumpleto para sa dalawang wika. Pero hindi ganito ang lumabas. Ganito ang lumabas sa Agham, no? So, maaaring ang conclusion natin dito ay baka hindi magandang indice ang classroom discussion para sukatin ang bisa ng isang wika, no? Isa itong mekanismo, hindi ba, para sa pagkatuto, pero baka hindi natin dito nakikita yung bisa ng isang wika. Baka nakikita natin ito sa pagbabasa o kaya sa ibang uri ng mga diskusyon. In any case, ganito ang lumabas sa kanilang pag-aaral, no? Alright. Tingnan natin ano yung resulta sa ibang mga asignatura, sa ibang mga pag-aaral, no? So, actually, sa lahat ng pag-aaral, Pilipino ang lumabas na wikang higit na epektibo, no? Sa 3 pag-aaral, walang nakalalamang, hindi significant yung difference, no? Pero sa arithmetic, advanced arithmetic, sa chemistry, sa advanced algebra, sa physics at sa biology, lumabas na ito yung mga klase, kabilang ito sa mga klase kung saan mas epektibo ang mas maraming natutunan ang mga estudyante sa gamit ang wikang Pilipino. Okay? So, isang simpleng paglalagob ng mga resulta, no? Maaari nating higit na busisiin ito at actually ganoon ang dapat gawin, pero mula dun sa aking paghahayag, makikita natin na malinaw ang wikang Pilipino ang mas epektibo sa 7 pag-aaral. May kiling sa Pilipino yung 5, yung disertasyon na diniscuss ko ngayon lang. Kasama yung kay Marian Russell, no? Sa pag-aaral ni Marian Russell kasi pinag-aralan niyang arithmetic sa grades 3 and 4, rural at urban. non-significant lahat ng differences maliban sa superiority ng Pilipino sa rural area, no? Ngayon, yung kay Davis, malinaw ba yon na wikang Ingles ang mas epektibo? May question mark tayo dahil yun nga, tulad ng sabi natin, na violate, no? Very strongly yung pagpapantay, no? Napakalaki na ng atensyon na binigay sa pagtuturo ng Ingles. By the way, hindi ko nabanggit sa inyo na yung training na binigay para sa Ingles ay para sa lahat ng mga teachers, no? Pati yung mga nagtuturo ng Pilipino as medium, no? Pati yung pangalawang grupo, lahat-lahat sila regardless of group you belong to. Kasi yung mga nagtuturo ng Pilipino, nagtuturo din sila ng English language arts, no? So sila nabinipisyohan din nung programa sa pagtuturo ng Ingles. At hindi makabuluhan ang pagkakaiba sa tatlong pag-aaral. Mar, ganong panahon ko pa meron?
Greg, pwedeng 2 minuto, matatapos mo ba?
Sige. Sige. All right. Well, sige. Doon sa 7 pag-aaral, 3 lang ang babanggitin ko. No, yung una, yung ulat ng Monroe Commission noong 1925. Ang Monroe Commission ay ang may kagagawa nito ay yung lehislatura, no, ng Philippine Commonwealth noong panahon yon, noong 1920s. Gusto nilang tingnan kung ano na yung resulta ng kanilang eksperimento, no, yung paggamit ng Ingles bilang wikang panturo. Malaking sample, 32,000, 24 na probinsya sa buong kapuluan, no. Ang nakita nila, ang kakayahan sa pagbabasa ng Ingles ng mga nasa 4th year high school ay kapantay ng kakayahan ng mga nasa grade 5 sa Amerika. Tandaan natin, English ang medium of instruction nito sa lahat ng antas, no? At this time. UP Science Education Center, Words in Science Philippines 1974, 40,837. Ang pinag-aralan nila, 787 na mga salitang Ingles na di-technical, no, na ginagamit sa Agham at Matematika. Ang resulta sa 4th year, ang porsyento ng nauunawaan ay, ito yung averages, 54% sa Luzon, 48% sa Bisaya, at 50% sa Mindanao. Kalahati ang naintindihan ng ating mga estudyante sa mga non-technical terms na ginagamit sa science and math. UP Science Education Center, Words in Elementary Science, ito yung counterpart study sa elementary level. Malaki rin ang sample, halos 30,000, 385 words, no? Salitang Ingles na di-technical. Ano nga ba itong mga ito? Among, lower, beside, behind, above. Mga ganyang klase ng salita. Sa mga pribadong eskwelahan, 78% ang kanilang naiintindihan on the average. Okay ba yun? Pero sa public schools, 49%. So parang tumutugma din dun sa findings sa Words in Science Philippines. Wawakasan ko ang aking pananalita sa itong ng mga revistang ito, no, na pwede nating sabihin na tinasa, no, inassess yung ang progreso natin sa pagtuturo ng ating mga bata. Wawakasan ko ito sa ulat na nagsimula, no, ng pagtatasang ganito na may kinalaman sa wikang panturo. Babasahin ko ang isang sipi, isang excerpt mula sa Monroe Commission Report. Mabalik tayo sa Monroe Commission Report. Ito ay 2 slides, no, na babasahin ko. Sa tingin ko mahalagang balikan natin itong mga ganitong klase ng dokumento. The findings can be interpreted properly. Ito yung paunang salita bago ihayag yung mga resulta noong kanilang ginawang malawakang pagtatasa, no, assessment ng naabot ng ating mga estudyante. The findings can be interpreted properly only in the light of the fullest appreciation of the difficulties which have confronted the Bureau of Education. The difficulties which have beset it have been many, but no other single difficulty has been so great as that of overcoming the foreign language handicap. A quarter of a century ago, the officials who undertook to solve the Philippine problem concluded that the greatest need of the people was a unifying language. Whether rightly or wrongly, they decided against the widespread use of any one or several of the dialects and began to organize instruction in English. From that day to this, all educational problems in the Philippines have been foreign language problems. At the outset, therefore, the American pioneers took upon themselves a Herculean task, the dual role of teaching a people a foreign language and at the same time of giving them a broad education through it. No other country has ever attempted to carry such a load. Aling country ang pinag-uusapan. We are measuring here for the first time the results of a nationwide attempt to solve a problem that is tremendously difficult. The foreign language handicap, therefore, is from the start a serious obstacle to success in teaching. From the day a Filipino child enters the school, he is confronted by the double necessity of mastering a strange tongue and of carrying on schoolwork in it. At no time in his career does he encounter the single task of studying in his mother tongue. He is required to learn to read not in Visayan, not in Tagalog, not in Ilocano, not in Bicol, but in English. Yun pong pag-aaral ni Aguilar, no, 25 years later, yung pioneering study ni Jose Aguilar sa Hiligay noon ay isang pagtatangka, no, na ipakita na hindi kailangang magpatuloy ang problemang ito, no? At ngayon, 75 years after the Aguilar study, or 1 century after the Monroe Commission report, sana po ay hindi natin ito makalimutan at gamitin natin ang talino, sipag, dedikasyon at lakas ng loob ni Jose Aguilar, no, para solusyonan ang problemang ito. Salamat po.
Salamat ng marami, Greg, sa malawak at malalim na pagtingin sa mga resulta ng pag-aaral at sigurado ako na may mga tanong at komento mula sa ating mga tagapakinig. Pero in the interest of time, we will move on to the next speaker at ipapakilala po ni Dr. Ricky Nolasco ang susunod nating tagapagsalita. Ricky.
Magandang umaga uli sa inyong lahat. Ang susunod na tagapagsalita ay isang kaibigan at isa sa dapat nating hangaan dahil sa kanyang pananaliksik tungkol sa L1-based multilingual education, no? Siya ay isang international literacy and education coordinator and senior literacy and education consultant, no, na nanggaling sa SIL lead, no. Kinuha niya yung kanyang PhD, Language and Literacies in Education, sa University of Toronto in 2016, no. Pero bago po niyan, lalong nakilala si Dayan sa Lubuagan experiment, no. Isa ito sa sabihin nating milestone na ng ating pag-aaral at paghahanap ng solusyon sa issue ng wika at edukasyon, no. Gusto kong ipakilala sa inyo si Dr. Dayan Decker. Dayan? Mute. You're muted,
Thank
Dayan.
you. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. I will just share my screen and we can get started, but it always takes a minute to find the right button for. Sorry about that. One day I'll have this down, but by then I'll be 90. Where am I going? Slideshow. Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to share with you. I enjoyed listening to you, Greg, and hearing a little bit more in depth about the previous studies on MLE, bilingual education in the Philippines. Some things were completely new to me, and it was good to learn about those. So I want to just start out by talking of some definitions that are really important for us to understand relating to bilingual education and mother tongue-based multilingual education. Because we do have a history in the Philippines of bilingual education, but that history of bilingual education is not defined in the same way that is traditionally defined in other countries. Traditionally, bilingual education starts with the first language of the learner and adds a second language of the learner. But in the case of the Philippines, we started with Filipino, which was often, particularly early on in the system, a second language, and then also added English, which was another second language. And as we talk also about mother tongue-based multilingual education, we're talking about starting with the learner's first language and then adding 2 additional languages. So just so that we're clear on those definitions, it will help us as we proceed through the conversation. I also wanted to start by sharing some quotes with you because English is so important in the Philippines, and it is the ultimate desire of every parent, every Filipino parent, that their child go to school and learn high proficient English, speaking, reading, and writing, because that is where the opportunities lie after school. And so I wanted to share with you a few quotes from English language teaching experts who weigh in on the value of the L1 in teaching and learning English, because what they say might surprise you a bit. So from this document entitled "The Role of the First Language in," I can't even read my own because of the pictures, sorry, "in English medium instruction," which was put out by Oxford Press. One of the things that they said is, research on multilingualism shows that languages known to an individual are mutually supportive, and there is extensive evidence of strong positive relationships between the proficiency in the first language and a second or additional language. This is from people whose job is to teach English around the world. And they have said, and clearly, what is commonly known in the Philippines among English language teachers is that the first language interferes with English, which is why there's a fear of bringing the first language into the English language classroom. But these experts on English language teaching have said that now, as a result of research over the last number of decades, there is agreement that there is no interference between the first language and the second language. Rather, they are both mutually supportive. And if you work with both languages in the language classroom, you're going to support the development of both languages. They go on to say that research has shown that students who are educated in both their first language and also in English tend to learn English more effectively and do better academically across the curriculum than their peers who are educated only in English. That might be a surprise because we have seen different results in the Philippines, but there are reasons for the results that we have seen. And I hope that we can dig down and explore some of those reasons today. Research also indicates that an inclusive attitude to students' L1 has positive effects on their personal and cultural identities, their social and emotional well-being, and their engagement in the education system. So I remember hearing DepEd statistics a number of years ago, maybe even a number of decades ago, where they were stating that actually when they compared the enrollment in grade 1 to the graduation in grade 10, that was before K-12, there were only 40% of those who enrolled in grade 1 who actually graduated from K-12. And I think it has a lot to do with social, emotional well-being and their engagement in the education system. So research shows that bringing their first language and their first culture into the classroom supports that. Further, their key messages really show that you have better acquisition of English when you bring the first language into the classroom, and you have better learning in other academic areas. And so that's really important. But what's really important right here is in the middle where it says early and sustained provision of L1 support improves students' engagement and motivation in education. We want to really look closely at the sustained component in the research studies that we're going to be looking at. So their conclusion is that there is rarely a strong case for English-only education, and they urge policymakers to consider alternatives that recognize and support students L1. I think really the only place where you might have a strong argument for English-only education is where you don't have teachers who speak the L1s, and therefore you cannot offer that. But in the Philippines, that is not our situation. So the first, as I said, there are so many studies out there that show the efficacy of bringing the first language into the classroom in a multilingual classroom. But there's so much evidence out there that we can't possibly look at all of it. So I'm just going to touch on a few studies, but I'm going to start with the Thomas and Collier study because it is so important. And it shows that actually, if you consider this picture of the caterpillar developing his chrysalis, then you know, because you know about caterpillars and butterflies, that once the chrysalis is finished, we have to wait until that butterfly is ready to come out. Otherwise, if we try to make that happen sooner than it's supposed to happen, that butterfly is not going to live. It's not going to work. It's going to be a failure. And that same idea of waiting for the proper time is really important. And it's really the point of the Thomas and Collier study. So let's look carefully at what they have done and what they have found. So in the context of their study was looking at bilingual education in the US, and that is first language plus English as a second language among non-native English language learners in the education system in the States. And it was because there was a growing bilingual education support and programs that were going on across the country, but there were also bitter battles between those who were for bilingual education and those who were against bilingual education. And they predicted also at that point in time, which was the late 90s and early 2000s, that by 2020, they would have an increase of about 55% of non-native English speakers within the school system. What actually happened is that they had about a 52% increase in non-native English speakers in the school system. And they were considering the whole global notion of education for all, which has been supported by UNESCO and others for some time now. And so they wanted to make sure we're finding the best program for English language learners in the US to be able to access education that helps them reach parity with native English speakers in the education system. So why? Why were they looking at this? Because the policy decisions were made on inadequate information. And because there were limitations, students were moving between schools and between places. And so that impacted how they were analyzed, how their data was analyzed. There were implementations on varying ways of implementing different types of bilingual education programs. And there was a general assumption that the gap between native English speakers and English language learners could be closed within 3 years. And so they wanted to look at all the programs that existed and see how long does it actually take for that gap to close. And they wanted to look at specific language groups and see how they fare in different types of programs over the long term. So not just in the early years, but throughout the whole basic education. They looked at 2 million student records. That means not 2 million students, but 2 million records of about 42,000 different students. So the sheer number and volume of records that they looked at show that their findings really cannot be questioned at all. And longitudinal was their perspective. So they looked at 11 years of schooling and those who had been in participating schools for 4 or more years. And they looked at different issues that would confound the findings that they first had, like social economic status or L1 language issues, or even the parents' ability to speak English at home. So they took all of those things into consideration in their study. And the students that they looked at, these 42,000 students, spoke 100 different languages. More than half of them were Spanish speakers because we have such a large population of Latinos in our country, but other languages were included: Arabic, Mandarin Chinese, Amharic, Korean, Russian, Vietnamese, etc. And they looked at 6 different types of bilingual education, that is L1 plus L2 education among English language learners, trying to determine which was the most effective. So in this slide, this shows you first the general graph. So you can see down at the bottom of the slide, grades 1 through 11 are looked at, and they're graphed here, showing us where kids scored compared to the program. And on the right-hand side, we have the different types of programs there that they looked at. Now, this green dotted bar across the top shows the average performance of native English speakers. It's not that they perform at 50%. Their average performance may be 80 or 85% or something like that. But it's where your average native English speaking student performed in school. And that was the goal. We wanted to bring English language learners to equal parity with native English speakers, so that when they finish school, they have equal access to all the opportunities that native English language speakers have. So let's look at each program. We'll start at the bottom on program number 6, traditional language-based English as a second language. For minority children, they had special classes where they were specially instructed in English as a second language, with the goal that they would be able to mainstream in the regular English only classes with enough English to support their ongoing learning. But you can see that by grade 11, they were way below the goal of parity with native English speakers. Program 5 was also way below the goal of parity with English language speakers. This program focused on content-based English as a second language. In other words, learning English through content instruction and in special classes where the teachers were specially trained for teaching that kind of English as a second language. And they also spent part of every day in the mainstream classroom. And they were mainstreamed fully out of their content-based ESL after 2 to 4 years. The objective was that their English would be strong enough that they would be able to function in a mainstream classroom without lagging behind in content areas. Program 4 is a transitional bilingual education with language-based English as a second language. This means that these students actually had 2 to 3 years of mother tongue teachers who spoke their mother tongue and who taught through their mother tongue and taught them initial literacy in their mother tongue as well. In addition, English was first introduced orally, and then later literacy for English was developed after they had conversational abilities, and it was taught as a subject, but it was not used for learning content. The objective was basic literacy in both languages and sufficient proficiency in English for mainstreaming. And you can see that they were still quite well below the goal of reaching parity with native English speakers. In program number 3, this was a transitional program that introduced English by teaching content. So they had 2 to 3 years of education from mother tongue speaking teachers using the mother tongue as a medium of instruction and for initial literacy. English was taught first orally with some instruction in basic English literacy, typically in a 50-50 ratio during the first year of school. Both languages were used for instruction according to a specific plan. And the objective was that children were to learn enough English and to master enough academic content to not be behind native English speakers when they were mainstreamed into classes. But they're still below the goal of parity with native English speakers. Program 2 was the first one that actually met the goal and actually surpassed it by 2 points. In this program, we have one-way development programs where students had at least 8 years of education in the mother tongue from mother tongue speaking teachers, where the mother tongue was used as a medium of instruction and to introduce reading and writing. and English was introduced orally first, with literacy added later. In some cases, when children were already familiar with English, they were exposed to L1 and L2 literacy at the same time. The objective was full proficiency in both languages by the end of grade 8. But if you look closely at our chart, you can see that they achieved this goal at about grade 7. 7 was when they went above the goal of parity with native English speakers. The last program is an interesting program that's challenging to replicate in many places. It's called a two-way development program, where you have equal number of minority language speaking students and native English speaking students in the same classroom throughout the whole educational course, KG through grade 12. And both languages are used for instruction according to a specific plan. And usually one language is used for instruction in the morning and another in the afternoon, and the students are teaching each other their own languages. The goal is that at the end of the day, students come out of there proficient in both languages. So this is challenging because it also occurs, generally speaking, when both languages have a similar prestige factor and development of literature. So it's hard to achieve that, but that's what happens when you have two-way development programs. This class actually met the goal by grade 6, earlier than expected. So what is the length of time to reach the goal of parity with native English speakers? In 4 of the programs, the students did not reach that goal. So when they graduated, they did not have the same opportunities post-high school as native English speakers. In other words, they couldn't get into college. They had to take different kinds of jobs and things like that. Their opportunities were fewer. But the students in the program number 1 reached grade level after 6 years, and students in grade 2 reached grade level after 7 years. So think about that 6 years and that 7 years and compare that with the chrysalis of the caterpillar and how waiting for the right time is crucial to make the goal that has been set out. And that is usually, in this case, parity with native English speakers. So you might ask, well, did they look at, socioeconomic status and other issues? Did they account for those? They did account for all of those in the study, and you can read about that if you find their study is available freely online. You can find it very easily, and you can read about that. They accounted for social economic status, they accounted for L1 language issues, and they accounted for parents' ability in English. But the key and the only significant factor was the time that they had in L1 in school. The more education they had in their L1, the better they do in L2 education. And you can look up Jim Cummins to see further. His studies show the exact same thing. So this study reinforces one of the quotes from the English language teacher expert panel that I referenced at the beginning of the study, and that is, early and sustained provision of L1 support improves students' engagement and motivation in education and learning English. So let's visit very briefly and very quickly a program that was done by my colleagues Steve Walter and Christine Trammell in Cameroon, the COM MLE program. They had 12 schools in this division in Cameroon that implemented L1 based MLE, and 12 English medium schools in the division were compared to those MLE schools. They were only permitted to have an early exit program, so they only had mother tongue instruction for grades 1 to 3. And in grade 4, the students were transitioned to English medium. Tests were administered by non-school personnel in grades 1 through 5. They wanted to see what happened in grades 4 and 5, and we'll look at that in a minute. So this is a brief glimpse of class 1 through 4, meaning grade 1 through 4. In 2010, and you can see the The reddish bar is the experimental class where they use mother tongue based multilingual education. And the lighter purple bar is the English medium class, which is the standard educational program in Cameroon. And you can see right off the bat that every year the experimental class outperformed, and often by a long shot, the other class. And just for your information, in the US, when they do educational research, if you find only 5 points advantage in the experimental program, the old program is thrown out and the new program is implemented across the board, because 5-point increase is so valuable. So you can see here that you have often, 25 or 30 points advantage in this case. So the summary of the findings of this early exit program are that when you use the mother tongue, it does bring significant improvements in learning outcomes in the first 3 years of innovation. But it also shows that once they leave the program in grade 4, those advantages that occurred in the first 3 grades start to decline. And by grade 5, some of those advantages, particularly in math, completely disappeared, and they were performing at the same level as the English medium students. But despite this decline in performance of experimental children, the advantages of having those first 3 years was still pretty good, especially in reading and learning of English. However, educational advantages developed in the experimental program with respect to math knowledge and skills declined in class 4 and disappeared in class 5. So that means you have to stay longer than grade 3 in order for those gains to be sustained, because if you transition to mainstream too soon, you will lose the gains that you developed in the first 3 years. So the recommendation from the Combs study is a 3-year period of the intervention is not long enough to adequately prepare students for an effective transition to L2 instruction. So let's look at the Lubuagan study. This is a study that I did with my colleague Steve Walter in Lubuagan, which is a place in the province of Kalinga in the Cordillera. And I'm going to share with you what we found and what we were looking for. The questions we were asking ourselves were, will the use of the first language of instruction, and will first language literacy improve educational outcomes for Lubuagan students? Our goals were to increase achievement scores across the curriculum, to develop stronger L2 and L3 acquisition, that's Filipino and English, and to lower dropout rates. So those were our goals. But the parents' highest educational value, as you well know, is for their children to acquire strong English language skills. In Lubuagan, we had 3 experimental schools paired with 3 control schools. They were matched for SES and all of those things. So in this chart, we see the composite of grades 1, 2, and 3 grades in all the subjects put together. The yellow bar represents the control, which is the traditional bilingual education where Filipino and English are used as medium of instruction. The red bar is the experimental program where the mother tongue was used to teach all of the subjects except Filipino and except English. So students still followed the traditional way of teaching English, or teachers rather, and the traditional way of teaching Filipino, but they taught initial reading in the first language, they taught math, science, civica, all the other subjects through the first language. And this is how they fared. You can see that the experimental class outperformed the control class in every year of the first 3 years. And if you put all of their scores together, if you rank them both programs together, you quickly see that among the top 40 were the experimental program students, and among the bottom 40 were the control class student. And there were no students in the experimental program who were in the bottom 20. This is a pretty significant glimpse at the outcome of this program. So if we look just at the languages, because we know that English and Filipino are so important to the parents of schools, we can see similar things. English and Filipino in all the grade levels were improved in the mother tongue based multilingual education classroom, where students only heard English for 1 hour a day, and they only heard and were taught Filipino for 1 hour a day. The rest of their day was given to mother tongue. And that's a big fear for most teachers and parents across the country, that, oh, if you bring the mother tongue in, they're going to lose their English. But if you do it right, and if teachers have the proper instruction and the proper materials and they know what they're doing, you will have this result, just like Thomas and Collier and the COM project also did. So we want to do away with that fear that English will be lost. If you look at this chart, which is a grade 1 chart, and it shows all of the subjects and their percentages of the test scores that we gave them, and you can see across the board in every single subject, the experimental class outperformed the control class. And you can look at this later. I will share this with you so that you can analyze it more closely, because we are going through this fairly quickly. In grade 2, you can see the same thing. Across the board, the experimental class outperformed the control class in every single subject. And the same thing in grade 3. So, using the mother tongue to teach the curriculum and still teaching English and Filipino in the traditional ways improves learning of the whole curriculum, including learning English and learning Filipino. So that's what the parents want. That's what they're really interested in, right? So what is our conclusion? Using the first language does not hinder learning the second language and the third language when it's done right and when teachers are well prepared and they have the materials that they need. And children can speak English and Filipino better when their L1 has a strong role in school. It's simply because they understand what's going on in the classroom, they follow the teacher, they're learning the curriculum content, and that learning in all the other subjects, including reading and writing through the L1, transfers to learning English and Filipino because they understand what's going on. But when English and Filipino are used across the curriculum through a submersion approach to education, students don't know what's going on. They don't understand the teacher. They can't respond to her questions. And they sit there in fear and intimidation, hoping the teacher is not going to call on them. But it's completely different when their first language is used, because they engage, they love going to school, they love participating in school, they have things to say, they want to be the first to speak up when the teacher asks a question. I love this picture because you can see the kids are not just raising their hands, sitting in their seats. They are standing on their benches and calling on the teacher, asking to be the one to give the answer because they understand her and they can answer the question that she is asking them. So they're very enthusiastic. And that contributes to the ongoing development of their higher advanced thinking skills. Whereas if it's English and they don't follow, their advanced thinking skills are delayed a bit until they can figure out what's going on in the classroom. So I just want to go through a little bit of a background, what went into the Lubuagan program before we did the study, so that you understand the difference between the national rollout of MTBMLE and what happened in Lubuagan, and that will help explain the difference in scores. So in Lubuagan, my husband and I, our family lived there. We moved there in 1988, I think. And we started in 1992 and worked for about 6 years just talking to everyone that would talk to us, our neighbors, influential people. We went to the mayor, we went to the schools, we talked to the principal, we talked to teachers, everybody who would talk with us about the value of L1 in the education system. And of course, you know, I mean, I put there 6 years we did this because, of course, as you can imagine, when we first started talking about this, people thought we were nuts. They thought we were crazy. Why would we think of putting the first language in education? My kid is in school to learn English. They already know their own language. Why would we introduce the first language? So they literally thought it was crazy. So we had to continue to talk about that and process the research behind it and why it's valuable. And we introduced writers' workshops so that teachers could become familiar with the orthography and become familiar with reading and writing their own first language before they were meant to be the teachers of that first language. And we did some initial materials development during those 4 years, but not a lot. Then we spent another 11 years with regular workshops. We always had a workshop in the summer. We often had workshops during October break. And in those workshops, we always did a whole bunch of different things. We always talked about theory. We always did some materials preparation. We always did some teacher training. We often did contextualization of the government curriculum so that teachers would understand how to take the goal of the curriculum and start it with what the children already know so that you're linking to their prior knowledge, leading them from what they know to what you want them to learn. And then we asked teachers to voluntarily implement between 2000 and 2004. We only really had about 2 or maybe 3 teachers who were willing to do that because that's kind of a big ask. But anyway, a few of them tried it. And then we officially implemented the program because we were doing a study on it, the Lubwagan study in 2005 and following. So you can see the number of years. I'm not saying that it's going to take this many years necessarily at the national level to be prepared to implement, but I am saying that it does take time, and we'll go into the things that need to happen in a little bit. So years of teacher learning and unlearning what their prior assumptions were, grappling with the rationale. Why is it that we should include the first language in education? And years of making materials in the first language. Teachers were not used to writing in their own language when we started. And so they had to figure out how to creatively write and then how to produce materials in the first language that they could use for teaching. And then thinking about methodology and experimenting in the classroom. The Lubwagan study shows the real capability of Filipino students when their language is valued and used well in school. However, the Lubwagan program cannot show sustainability of results because we only looked at the first 3 grades. We only had permission to implement in the first 3 grades. We didn't have permission to go beyond that. And actually, talking of permission, there was a point, a time where we were proposing that we implement a full program in the district. And one of the teachers who was a head teacher at that time and later became a principal said, you know, we cannot do this legally. DepEd will not allow, we have to follow the policy of the Department of Education. So you would have to get us a note from the Secretary of Education before we felt free to implement this program. So we were able to get it. That's when Brother Andrew Gonzalez was Secretary of Education. And we asked him for that note. And he said, based on the low achievement scores across the country, teachers are permitted to innovate in the classroom. And that is what we were able to base the implementation of the program on in Lubwagan. I just want to reference you to this very powerful statement that I just loved when I came across it by Congressman Magtangal Gunigundo in his privileged speech to Congress. I'm just going to read it because it's so powerful. He says, the over-focusing and over-privileging of one region's language and literacy imagination has a parallel development in the writing of our nation's history. The struggles in the various regions for freedom and democracy have been ignored in favor of the political center's narrative of the making of the nation. Hence, the pantheon of heroism in the national struggle marginalizes the roles of Dagohoy of Bohol, Leon Kilat, I'm probably butchering these names, I'm sorry, of Cebu, and Sultan Kudarat of Mindanao, among many others in successive generations of Philippine heroes. In order to correct these historical and cultural inequities, Mr. Speaker, a cambio sa pananaw, or a shift in perspective, as some Visayan friends call it, is very much in order, especially on how we value our linguistic and cultural diversity. It is this diversity that we must recognize as our social and cultural resource and our intellectual capital. By this diversity, we shall be able to evolve a truly liberating education, an education that teaches our people the collective virtue of a Philippine nation, built upon the variety of memories, experiences, dreams, aspirations, and ambitions of our different ethno-linguistic communities. Our people know we are many, and out of this manyness, we are committed to one national community. This, Mr. Speaker, is our guiding light in nurturing our cultural pluralism. The italics were added by me, not by the author, because I thought those were very pertinent statements in this. But it shows that there are plenty of people in the Philippines who realize the value of valuing all the languages and all the cultures of the Philippines and using that to create a unity of the Filipino rather than ignoring all of that diversity and that richness of legacy and trying to create a unified nation out of just one language and culture. So if I have time, I would like to quickly go into, I'll just take a few minutes to look at my doctoral research, because in this research, I was looking at how teachers navigate the new policy. It was after the policy was implemented by DepEd, and I wanted to understand how teachers dealt with that policy and what it did to their work inside the classroom. But before we get into this, I want to start with this quote by Dr. Jim Cummins, where he says, "Genuine educational reform starts with the choices that educators make regarding their own identities as educators and the identity options they envision for their students." This really resonated with me because I know that every Filipino teacher sees themselves primarily as a language teacher. They are developing a nation of English language speakers. That's their job. That's their privilege. That is their honor. So as English language teachers, what are they doing in the face of this statement? Now you get to teach in the first language without sufficient training and materials for knowing how to do that well. So that's what I was looking at. And I found too that teachers said, some of the teachers that I interviewed said, I am not going to withhold English from my students. That's how powerful their English language teaching identity was. They would reject the policy and they would do something different because they were not going to allow their students to lose English language proficiency. So let's look at what I learned. Among the teacher responses that I interviewed, there was a continuum between fear of losing English language proficiency and just plain old intimidation of how do I do this? And why on earth are we bringing these languages into the classroom that have never been used academically? They're oral languages and we value them and we appreciate them, but we've never used them academically in the classroom. And how do we do that? And so being afraid and intimidated by that task that they have to learn and define them for themselves as well. On the other side, there were a number of teachers who were overjoyed with this. One teacher said to me, "I have waited so many years for this to happen." She said, "I know intuitively that this is the best thing for my students, and I have waited for this policy to happen," because they know intuitively that that is the way their students understand and learn in the classroom best. So that is the continuum of responses from the teachers that I interviewed in this piece of research. But I just wanted to comment, I'm not going to read all of these quotes, but I just wanted to comment and say that every single teacher, whether they were for the policy or against the policy, agreed that children understand better, they interact more, and they enjoy learning more through the mother tongue. Even the one who said to me, "I will not withhold English for my students," agreed. "Yes," she said, "I know they understand better, and I know that they enjoy learning more through the mother tongue, and they interact better too when we use the mother tongue, but I'm still not going to withhold English from them." So across the board, they know the efficacy of MTB-MLE, whether they implement it or not. So there's two sort of sets of discussions that go around this compliance and resistance to implementing the policy. Some of these commonly discussed issues, which you're very familiar with. How do we do this? We don't have mother tongue materials. We have to retrain every teacher in the whole country. We need social support, and we don't have social support. We need social support from politicians, from business owners, from the parents, from all the teachers and principals and supervisors and superintendents, etc. And they talked about teacher status. This is going to demote us in the eyes of society, because we're not going to be producing these English language speakers that society is demanding from us. And then, of course, they talked about the sheer dominance of the English language in the Philippines, and how highly reputed English is, and how highly reputed people who speak high levels of very proficient English are in the Philippines. Those are all commonly discussed issues. Less commonly discussed issues are societal ideologies around languages and societal power relations that relate to who gets to power positions. How related is their language proficiency to obtaining a position of influence? Those kinds of things. And then nobody often talks about teachers' personal histories. Teachers are the product of the old system. They learned English through submersion. They learned Filipino through submersion. All of their subject content was learned through submersion in English and Filipino. And we have to recognize that. And we have to say they can't just make the switch. It's not like switching a light on and off. It takes a lot of work for teachers to explore and understand the issues, and to account for their own history, their own underlying assumptions, and make changes in those, which takes time and effort. And of course, also what was not discussed either was their perceptions of the policy. You know, did anybody ask the teachers, do you think this is a good idea or a bad idea? Because essentially it was a top-down policy. This is what the DepEd says, so now you're meant to do it. And there was no advocacy to help people understand why the DepEd chose this policy. They made a very good choice, but there was no explanation for what led to that choice, and that was problematic in the classes. And I do apologize, I'm going very quickly and very succinctly over this research, but students' identities were also part of it. Students need to feel a belongingness in school, and that comes only when their language is incorporated in the classroom and their culture, so that they feel this is my class, this is my school, I'm learning based on what I already know, rather than going to school and saying, leave your identities at the door, because in here we only speak English. This is an English only place, and I'm only going to talk to you in English. That destroys their identities in many ways for most kids. And then using the first language gives them confidence as capable learners, versus being afraid that they're going to fail, being afraid that they can't respond to the teacher, that their answer is wrong, that they don't understand what's going on. I spoke with one teacher whose husband, over the course of my research, which took me a year and a half to do, over the course of her processing our conversations with her husband, the husband ultimately said later and told his wife, I want you to go back and tell that researcher what I'm saying. He said, you know, as I really reflect hard on my own educational experience, it wasn't until I was in grade 6 that I really started to understand what was going on in the classroom. And he says, I'm startled by the fact that I stayed in school until then, because those first years, I really wasn't following anything that was going on. And I think that's a common experience for many Filipinos, but it's not something that we talk about readily. It's not something that we visit, because it's not a prideful fact. It's not something we want to talk about. It's not something we want to explore together very easily. And of course, ability to understand the lesson so that you can follow, you can understand what's going on, what you're meant to learn, and you can actually learn it well, rather than just memorizing so that you're just repeating it back without any comprehension. And of course, reading and writing in the first language can easily incorporate higher level thinking skills from the very beginning. You can develop higher order thinking skills in preschool, but most teachers don't realize that because they don't know how to do it, and they don't know that it's possible. But when you use a language that the learner is familiar with, you can absolutely do that. So what do teachers need in order to implement MTB-MLE? First of all, Many of them may not be proficient in reading and writing their own L1. Maybe it's just an oral language that they've used forever and ever, which they highly value and appreciate, and which is part of their identity, but it's never been an academic language and it's never been a literate language for them personally. So they need to develop that. They need to learn new ways of teaching reading and writing. The old ways where you first learn the whole alphabet and then you jump into blocks of text like that, those are ineffective and inadequate. Those are so outdated. It's absolutely pathetic that they're still being used. Now, what we do is we base teaching the symbols on a frequency count. What's the most frequent letter in the language? And we build words from lesson 1 so that kids are learning to read meaningful text from the very first lesson, or if that's really challenging, at least from lesson 2. By the time they get to the 4th letter, they should be able to put words together in the first language. And that helps them understand that reading is meant for meaning from day 1. And then new methods for developing oral L1. How do you work on expanding and extending and deepening students' oral L1 abilities so that it empowers their ability to think about higher level things as well, and explicitly understanding L1 grammars. Teachers, Filipinos across the board, have studied English language grammar throughout their whole entire educational career, basic education and college, their MA programs, their PhD programs. They have looked at English grammar. And so there is a tendency to look at the grammar of their L1 through the lens of English, but it doesn't fit. It's like forcing a round peg into a square hole. So teachers need opportunities to understand how Philippine language grammars work, and that will help them understand how to teach those languages as well, and the grammar of those languages. They need to have opportunities to develop creative writing in their first language. And at first, when we were doing that in Lubuagan, it was very challenging. The teachers, because they were all college graduates, had produced papers, academic papers in school and things. They were familiar with doing research, and this guy says that and the other guy says that, and that kind of thing. But in terms of writing creatively, a creative story, that took a little more time for them to develop and become fluent in. So they need opportunity to do that. And then also, you know, teachers will always say, we can't teach in L1 because there's, how do we talk about photosynthesis? How do we talk about multiplication? The word multiplication doesn't exist in our own language and things like that. So they have to decide, what are we going to do? What terms are we going to use? How will we navigate that whole gulf too between the languages in terms of academic vocabulary? And then, of course, learning how to teach academic content through the first language is a new thing, and they need to have new methods for how to do that, as well as new methods for developing second languages. There was a time in Lubuagan where we were trying to understand the practices of teachers, and I was asking them, why do you think you rely so heavily on rote memorization? And over time, one of the teachers really was thinking about that. And finally, she came back to me sometime later and she said, the reason we rely on rote memorization is because that's the only recourse we have. That's the only way we know how to teach. We are teaching in English, through English. Nobody understands English, so we just have to say this after me and hope that somewhere down the line, when they've had enough of it, they catch it. And that's exactly what happens to everybody who goes through school. But if you learn new ways of teaching second languages, then kids can learn those languages sooner with comprehension and begin to use those languages sooner, as we saw in the Lubuagan study. And then, of course, understanding how to contextualize the curriculum. Our aim is to meet the curriculum goals that DepEd has set out. But our aim is also to start with what the learner already knows. So think about that goal, and then what is there in the culture or in his prior knowledge that we can link that to start with. And that gives them a way to link into their current schema what they understand about that curriculum item.
Diane?
Yes, do you need me to stop?
2 minutes.
Okay. So also learning about activity-based learning and modern methods of teaching second languages, etc. Okay, I'm just going to run through this. So When DepEd implemented, if you remember, I said in the Lebuagan study, we took many, many years of preparation. But when DepEd implemented, there was no advocacy or very little advocacy or explanation of why the policy was even chosen by DepEd. And that is what was needed by the teachers. They needed to understand, why are we moving to the first language? What's wrong with English? I learned English through the old system. Why do I have to teach this way for my kids? Teachers and parents and school officials need to understand why the policy is being implemented if they're going to support it. Then, of course, substantial and ongoing training is needed, and development of materials is needed, and it should be something that's not left to teachers to pocket themselves for the printing of those materials. Okay, if we're going for transforming the educational experience in the Philippines for every Filipino learner, if we start with transformative pedagogies, where we develop L1 oral proficiency, we develop it and deepen it in an ongoing way, we develop L1 literacies, and we build languages and learning and on foundation of the learner's first language for as long as possible, at least through grade 6, without ever banning the L1 from school, then we will develop strong identities where local languages are highly valued across the country, where home cultures are highly valued and people know this, and where local knowledge is highly valued. I remember hearing from one principal in the North. She was an Ilocano principal, and she said to me one time, she said, you know what? We are so thrilled with this policy because for the first time ever, our language is being acknowledged by the Department of Education, and they're borrowing the books that we write in Ilocano and telling people to translate them into other languages. She said, at the same time, we're scared to death because we don't know what this is going to do to language proficiency among our kids. Those two things, transformative pedagogies, strong identities, will transform multilingual and multicultural society as a whole by producing confident identities, multilingualism for academia, where all languages are used academically and not just socially, multicultural education, and it will strengthen the Filipino global participation, which I know is a primary motivation among every Filipino family. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat.
Maraming salamat, Dayan. No? Medyo talagang konti yung oras. At Marv, do we have time for questions o mamaya na lang?
Siguro mamaya na lang in the interest of time dahil meron pa tayong 3 reactor.
Sige, sige. Okay.
Maraming salamat, Dayan. Ngayon po ay dadako na tayo sa ating mga reaktor. Ang una po ay si Dr. Fortunato Sevilla mula sa Universidad ng Santo Tomas. Feb, pwede mong pakita ang slide. Si Dr. Sevilla po ay isang professor emeritus sa Departamento ng Kimika sa UST. Naging dekano din siya ng Kolehiyo ng Agham, katuwang ng reaktor sa saliksik at pagbuo at direktor ng Sentro ng Saliksik sa Likas at Aplikadong Agham. Siya po ay nagtapos na summa cum laude sa UST, may degree Master of Science at PhD din sa larangan ng instrumentasyon at analytical science mula sa University of Manchester sa Inglaterra. Siya po ay isang academician sa Pambansang Akademya ng Agham at Teknolohiya o NAST at naging bisitang profesor sa Universidad Autonoma de Barcelona, sa Universidad Popular Autonoma de Estado del Puebla, at siya rin po ay kinilala sa kahangahangang mga ginawa sa mga larang ito ng Professional Regulation Commission, NRCP, at ng DOST. Tinataguyod ni Dr. Sevilla ang paggamit ng wikang Filipino sa pagtuturo sa Agham at ginamit niya ito sa kanyang pagtuturo ng mga masulong na kurso sa kimika. Dahil dito, hinirang siya na kampyon ng wika ng Komisyon ng Wikang Filipino. Sir Fortune?
Yeah, gandang umaga sa inyo lahat. Nadididiban niyo ako?
Opo, yes. So,
yeah. Well, maraming salamat sa mga pinahiwatig o sinabi ni Dayan at saka ni Greg, at dapat pakinggan ito ng ating DepEd at makita ang dahilan ng mababang grado ng ating mag-aaral sa mga international test tulad ng PISA at ng TIMSS. Laging sinasabi na kaya mababa ang mga grado natin, mga bata natin, ay dahil hindi sila marunong ng Agham, Matematika o ano pa. At hindi tinignan na dahil ba ito sa kanilang yung mahinang pag-intindi dahil sa pag-wikang ginamit. Maraming, ang mga estudyante natin ay kumukuha ng test sa wikang Ingles at hindi sinasalin sa Filipino. Samantalang sa ibang bansa, tulad ng Thailand, ng China, Malaysia, sinasali ng mga tanong sa wikang sa kanilang sariling wika, pero sa atin ang pinagamit natin ay yung wikang Ingles. Sa aking ang aking experience ay sa tertiary education, So wala akong masyadong experience sa primary at secondary education. Pero sa aking pagtuturo ng kimika, napapansin ko na madali nila maintindihan ang aking sinasabi pag gagamitin ko sa Filipino, ang aking pagtuturo. Sa mga grado, halos pantay, wala makikita ang pag-iiba, pero napapakita na mabisa, may bisa ang aking sa pag-itindi. Sa mga datos na pinasentan ni Greg, na kung saan ang resulta ng pagtuturo sa wikang Ingles at wikang Filipino ay halos pantay. Pinapakita dito na kasing bisa ang Filipino ng wikang Ingles sa pag-intindi ng tinuturo. Marami ang humaharang o humahadlang sa paggamit ng wikang Filipino sa pagtuturo sa kolehiyo. Sinasabi nila mawawala ang ating advantage sa wikang Ingles. Pero yung sinasabi ko sa kanila na bakit ang mga ibang bansa na hindi gumagamit o hirap sa Ingles ay umaasenso, mas magaling pa sa atin. Ang Alemanya, ang Thailand, gamit nila ang kanilang sariling wika sa pagtuturo ng Agham, mas napati sila kaysa sa atin. So walang kinalaman ang kagalingan sa Ingles sa kagalingan sa kagalingan sa Agham. At inaasahan ko na magkasundo lahat ng mga scientists dito sa Pilipinas na gamitin ang wikang Filipino sa kanilang panayam at sa kanilang diskurso na pang-Agham. Ang problema ngayon, marami ang hindi sanay. Marami nagtatanong, anong salita ang gagamitin? Kung hindi natin umpisahan ngayon, at payagan yung gustong magturo sa Pilipina, yung gustong magpaliwanag sa Pilipino, ay hindi tayo makakarating sa estado na kung saan ang Pilipino ay ginagamit na lahat at hindi titingnan ng mas mababang wika sa salita sa paliwanag ng Agham. May isang magandang nangyayari na ang paggamit ng Filipino sa mga formal na meetings o activities sa universidad. Sa ngayon, hindi na minamata ang mga estudyante na gumagamit ng Filipino sa kanilang pag-defend ng kanilang disertasyon. Sa mga meeting na formal o ng mataas na administrasyon, tinatanggap na ang paggamit ng Filipino. Hindi na minamata ang mga gumagamit ng Filipino. Sinasabi, hindi marunong mag-Ingles, kaya nagpi-Filipino. Dahan-dahan siguro na natatanggap na ang paggamit ng Filipino sa mataas na diskurso, sa mataas na pagkukulong. Yun lang sa ngayon, marami pang humahadlang. At well, sa aming Chemical Society of the Philippines, sa kapisahan ng Kimika ng Pilipinos, ay hindi pa rin magkasundo na gamitin ang Filipino sa pagtuturo ng Agham. Ang tanong, ano mga katagang gagamitin? Well, kung di natin gagamitin ang Filipino sa pagpapaliwanag sa kimika, hindi lalabas ang mga katagang kailangan natin gamitin. At inaasahan po na yung resulta ni Dayan ay pansinin ng DepEd. At sa gayon, well, yung mga estudyanteng darating sa kolehiyo ay magiging magaling na hindi lang sa wikang Ingles, kung hindi pati sa kanilang larang na gustong maging espesyalista. Yun lang. Maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat, Dr. Sevilla. So ngayon po ay tutuloy tayo sa pangalawang reactor natin, Ricky.
Salamat, Mar, no? Isa ring kaibigan si Dr. Alan Bernardo. Pareho yung aming high school sa Lourdes School of Quezon City, no? At si Dr. Bernardo is a distinguished university professor and university fellow at De La Salle University. His current research relates to four broad themes: polyculturalism, intergroup relations in intercultural context. Pangalawa, cultural aspects of hope, character, strengths, and well-being. At pang-apat, socio-economic inequality and other social inequalities. And D, socio-cultural aspects of learning and achievement. No? Matagal na naming hinahatak si Alan dito sa conversation na ito. Alam ko na marami rin sa atin ang medyo mababa ang loob at nawawalan minsan ng gana dahil kapag nakakausap natin yung mga policy makers, parang kausap natin yung pader, no? Alan, baka meron kang aambag sa ating conversation ngayon.
Maraming salamat, Ricky. Actually, I have prepared a very brief PowerPoint reaction. Let me just give me 1 minute to share it. Habang inayos ko ito, I'd like to thank Mario for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And thank you very much, Greg and Diane, for the very clear and lucid presentations. And I will drill down on 6 points that I think will be very important for our future discussions on the topic, which I'm just reifying some points which I thought were very important from Greg's and Diane's presentations. So first, this was highlighted in Diane's presentation. And if you read her publication on the Lubuagan experiment, the thing that struck me was that it's the teaching of L1 that was the experimental. And I think the default option apparently in the community that she was studying, and this was to some extent reflected in the qualitative data, the default option is that the medium of instruction should be English. And I think this is a very important point that we need to think about, because we have to reflect on why we assume that certain things should be the way they are. So as Diane highlighted, that in some educator communities, the assumption that instruction should be in English is kind of entrenched, and it's not even challenged. And I also invite the members of PAASE to reflect on this. We might have our own assumptions about what the language should be, but we should interrogate that and question what are the assumptions, whether those assumptions are valid or not. And I think what Diane's presentation highlighted is there might be ideological aspects or underpinning of those assumptions. Now, the second point that I want to highlight is that learning is not one thing. Those who don't study learning tend to sometimes assume that it's a big thing that is either there or not there. But as Greg's presentation highlighted, if you look at the different experiments that look into the effect of either Filipino or English, there are many different outcomes that language may have an effect on. And learning scientists know this for decades, that learning is not just one thing, it's not hierarchical, it doesn't have a fixed structure. Instead, learning outcomes are varied, they're distinct. But what we know is that learning outcomes tend to be hierarchically related. What does that mean? So there are lower actions, whether it is in math, science, civica, even in reading, but there are higher order actions that organize or reorganize these lower actions in a more meaningful way so that they're qualitatively more complex. I underscore this because the experiments that Greg highlighted kind of tap different outcomes. And you will see that what I want to highlight in our own reflection is that language may be playing very different roles depending on what learning actions we are looking at. I think Diane did mention that at some level, language maybe stops becoming a factor. And this is something that I would like invite PAASE members to acknowledge, because I think PAASE values the discussion of what language should be used if we eventually want more Filipinos to be engaging the global scientific community, reading the scientific literature. Now, what I want to highlight is that there are steps towards that. There are many different outcomes that lead to that. And language may have an effect or varying effects depending on what outcomes we are speaking of. Now, the third point that I want to highlight was underscored very clearly in Diane's presentation, and that is learning has a strong affective and social component. It's not just knowledge, it's not just cognitive. And the motivational processes can either facilitate or impair engagement in learning tasks. If you look at PISA data recently, the social cognitive and motivational aspects are very strong predictor of poor achievement. And as Diane highlighted, the language used in learning are very strongly related to these motivational engagement, this sense of belonging and feeling that they are part of a community in the school. So this should be part of our conversation as well. Now, the fourth point, and this relates to my second point about learning being hierarchical with lower order and higher order actions involved. We do realize that much of learning that happens in school involves a lot of learning. During the pandemic, many students were left to work with modules that had to make them process text, very dense text, on their own. And related to this hierarchy of learning outcomes, I want to underscore the importance of functional literacy skills as scaffolds for much of formal learning. So Dr. Fortune kind of highlighted this, no? So you need to be able to access concepts first before you can begin engaging in higher level thinking about scientific concepts. And therefore, we should highlight the important role of language in literacy acquisition. Both Diane and Dr. Fortune highlighted this perhaps misassumption that languages are competing against each other. But as much of the research shows, and Diane also highlighted this, once you establish functional literacy in the mother tongue, it becomes a very strong scaffold for introducing a second, a third, a fourth language. In fact, it's the pedagogy in which you use to introduce additional languages that is very important. That is a pedagogy that provides comprehensible input. This is what language acquisition researchers call that. You use language in a way that connects with what children understand. and in a way where the languages are additive and mutually supportive instead of introducing languages to the detriment of the earlier languages. Now, the fifth point I want to highlight here is this was highlighted by Dr. Fortune and Diane's presentation also, and the teacher's role in providing good comprehensible input in the classroom. Greg's experiments, the experiments that Greg summarized were all done decades ago, and I cannot help but wonder whether the language proficiencies of teachers today are as good as during the days when those experiments were done. Because even the DepEd data on the language proficiency of our teachers shows very low English language proficiency, even among the English majors. So this is something we need to consider when we speak of both mother tongue and English language instruction. We need to understand that teachers need to be able to explain concepts in procedures in the domain. So it's not a generic language proficiency, it's language proficiency in the domain, because what is important is the teachers make the content and the procedures comprehensible to the learner. So their knowledge of the language needs to be sufficiently complex to model the complexity of the knowledge in the domain as well. Aside from the teachers, I'm also calling attention to the learning resources. This is textbooks, modules, and so on, and other language models that students need. Now, my last point is that ultimately what we're discussing in this Fireside chat is what language should be used. Now, I think what Diane highlighted is that this is not a simple proposition, because the function of language in learning science and math is multidimensional, it's multifarious. It is developmental. It's not just clicking a switch. There are changes that need to happen at a particular time. Unfortunately, the tendency in a lot of policy making, both at the local level and at the national level, is a one-size-fits-all approach, which you see is a total mismatch to the experiences of learners in multilingual learners in a multilingual society. And in a sense, I guess Ricky was hinting at this in my frustration, where policymaking seems to be uncomfortable and unable to deal with the complexity of learning and instruction. And if we look at what policymakers are, quote unquote, good at, it is at setting minimum standards, controlling the actions of the actors, particularly the teachers, through very rigorous monitoring bordering on surveillance of their behavior, and basically allocation of very limited amounts of funds. So I think part of the discussion is, although there are very good ideas in terms of how to make language a more resourceful tool in a multilingual society, we have to look into the process of reforming our current practices and whether the institutions that are mandated to do these reforms actually are capable of doing reform. I suppose I will close with this point that given the constraints in the policymaking environment, what we may need to aim for is a reasonable space where teachers and schools are allowed to experiment and do what they can, like what Diane mentioned, is just get permission to do what they think is right. And then once we provide, get the students to be in that space where they have a solid functional literacy, learning science and math will be in a much safer ground. I'm going to end here to give room for other discussion, and thank you very much for listening.
Maraming salamat, Alan, sa malalim na pagtalakay sa mga pag-aaral at mga diskusyon na pinigay kanina ni Dr. Sibilia at ganun din sa pagtalakay ni Dayan. Siguro mamaya may mga tanong tayo na tutukoy sa ilang mga puntos na sinabi mo. Pero ngayon, ang ating pangatlong tagapagbigay ng reaksyon, si Dr. Giovanni Malapit. Si Gio ay nairekomenda ni Professor May Lim at inimbita natin agad dahil sa kanyang karanasan sa pagtuturo, no, ng physics sa UP Baguio at ang ilan pa niyang mga pag-aaral o karanasan. So he graduated from with BS Physics Math at UP Baguio and MS and PhD in Physics at NIP at UP Diliman. Dr. Malapit is currently pursuing his newfound passion in contextualized physics education, multilingual, multicultural, and multidisciplinary approach. Gio?
Thank you very much, Mar. And thank you very much sa ating mga speakers, Greg and Diane. I learned a lot from your presentations as a novice practitioner of mode of instruction in the sciences. Okay, so I'll start with a story. Okay, so in 1997, I was involved in an endeavor to teach science in Filipino at UP Baguio. And it was in our natural science subject, Agham Pangkalikasan. I taught the physics part. And during that time, I don't recall any training provided to us to teach physics in Filipino. So they just gave the textbook. So I struggled with some of the new words and the direct translations that the textbook contained. In the book, some scientific and technical terms were retained, like mass, inertia, electron, proton. Some were translated, like magnetic field, magnetikong larang. Some were in English, like action at a distance, uniformly accelerated reference frame. And there were equations too, involving square roots, small numbers like 10 to the minus 9, big numbers like 10 to the 8, etc. So some students enjoyed it, but some did not. I can see some students having fun, some students some of them were frustrated because maybe they're not used to it because they already have ideas about mass, inertia, and so on, and all in English, but in high school. So there were moments also when the continuity of our discussion was interrupted by on-the-spot real-time translations. For instance, ang dalawang charges na magkaparehas ay magre-repel. A student would ask, "Sir, what is repel in Filipino?" So I have to think. So maybe it's pagtataboy, but I don't think that will fit what is the context in my lecture. So I just told them that let's just stick to repel because the book is bilingual anyway. So now I am thinking if I'll use this book in other schools in other parts of the country, I guess it will generate varying receptions and feedback, because what works for a student in a specific region may not always work for students in another. There are different conditions per region, per city, municipality, per village. From experience, I can tell you that. So our country indeed has many ethno-linguistic groups. In North Luzon alone, we have about 50 or more. And choosing a single language as a medium of instruction poses a big challenge, especially in the sciences and math. The level of science and math is also a factor, I think. If a student wants to be a scientist someday and intends to do serious scientific research involving advanced math and coding, I'm not sure if our local languages are rich enough at this point to explain current trends and future trusts, maybe in the future. On the other hand, if we want our students to learn, appreciate, and understand basic math and fundamental sciences at an early age, we ought to use the best language or combination of languages suited for them. If it is their first language, why not? Numerous studies support this. Multilingual approach, so be it. We just need the bridging process or the transition phase from L1 to L2 to be effective. Now, it starts with the development of quality and age-appropriate learning materials. This is what I'm doing right now, Ilocano physics materials. And in the process, I've encountered problems. For instance, what will I do with technical terms? Should I borrow them? Should I respell them? Should I invent new words? And so on. That's one problem. Another one is when I went to different provinces in North Luzon, I observed that Ilocano has many dialects, many variations. So Ilocano in Ilocos is different from Ilocano in Kalinga, in Mountain Province, in La Union, and so on. So how do we standardize this? We even have 2 orthographies. So I'm in the process of checking on those challenges. Okay, so another one is superb teacher training. As you saw a while back, my performance during the time I taught Filipino physics was not very good compared to the sections where I taught physics in English, because I did not have any training. Okay, so I guess that's a factor. So we should train our teachers to teach the sciences, the math, and everything in whatever language necessary. But first, we have to have these learning materials. Then after that, constant monitoring and assessment, not just for a semester or a year, but longer. So I recall this 1997 project. It was not renewed, I guess. So I'm wondering what happened to that project. It has to be longer than a semester. Okay, this is to check the consistency of what we are doing. If we need to innovate further by consciously integrating cultures, experiences, livelihoods vis-a-vis their environment, environmental protection, career guidance, and so on in the learning materials, why not? Okay, this is an alternative for the students. So it is also an opportunity for our teachers to do research, action research or basic research or blue skies research and so on. So thank you very much for the presentations. I've learned a lot. Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Gio. Marami rin kaming natutunan from everything that you related to us about your experiences teaching physics in, the languages. So ngayon, Ricky, magtatalakayan na tayo. So marami pong mga insightful comments sa chat box. Pwede po nating basahin mula kina Dr. Rod Azanza, President ng National Academy of Science and Technology, si Dr. Al Serafica, si Dr. Ched Arzadon, at si Dr. Ricky Nolasco. Nagtataas ng kamay si Al.
Thank you, Mario. I'm just wanting to really thank everyone for taking their time today on a holiday to share your learnings, from Greg to Alan, and definitely Diane's experience in the Buagan is very insightful. I'm just putting it a little bit. When I came to this talk, I was so busy in the last 2 days and have to kind of ask myself, is it worth it? And when I came here, actually, it was really an eye for the 3 issues that I wanted to know in learning. That's, of course, the I'm now heading a foundation for STEM education, Center for Integrated STEM, where we do integrate STEM. And one thing that resonates to me in the three areas that you presented, both Greg and Diane, is to me the missing item on socio-emotional learning. And if we could have qualified or quantified the socio-emotional state of the kids when they're doing in their mother tongue, it was clearly evident that they're all enticed. Ganado sila. Hindi sila takot, hindi sila alienated by the language kasi mother tongue nga nila. So tingin ko that's a worth of an experiment probably to see if we can just demonstrate a multilingual teaching method, especially in the early years, show the socio-emotional state by just having an engagement. Tuwa ba kayo? Hindi kayo natutuwa? Or pangit ba talaga? Wala ba kayo natutunan? O ayaw nyo mag-aral? In that, wherein it's really a socio-emotional state. So that's number one that I just really highlighted, that it might be a worth engaging our best thinkers with Alan and Greg there. So that's the number one that came to me that we need to follow on that. And of course, the only two other items that I just want to highlight, not for today's discussion, but to how to address our ongoing learning poverty of 9 out of 10-year-olds cannot read and comprehend. And then even the bigger monster out there that's completely, I don't know how to tackle, is the one that Father Niebres has always openly spoke in our fireside chats here in PAASE, is the whole issue on growth stunting. How do we get the growth stunted kids to start to learn? And I think the secret partially is in this discussion on the multilingual capability, engaging them early, even though they only understand minimal concepts because they're stunted. But the mere fact that we can get them to the track back, it's like, I remember having a relative who's ADHD in the beginning, and because of her mother taking the time and putting her on track and gradually developing the kid, now he's doing his PhD in music. So parang learning. I was with UP yesterday. Sabi sa akin ni Dr. Chong, Dean of UP Manila, if we catch the kids who are deaf before they're 7 years old, we will be able to teach them how to talk. But if we don't catch them, we'll forever lose them and they'll be a burden to society. So ganun din yung iniisip ko dito. Medyo malaki. Pero just to tell you, guys, thank you very much for taking the time, even the reactors, Doc Sevilla, and of course our friends in UP Baguio, Dr. Malapit. I think we have a big follow-on discussion on this, but I'm just trying to get you because I'm in the front lines on STEM education, social-emotional learning, even advanced manufacturing skills for Industry 4.0. So I'm trying to connect it because I did help the whole spectrum from K to 12 now with system, but I was already in the National Academy focusing on technology transfer. So this is really a learning experience for me. So thank you. Thank you.
Meron po bang gusto magbigay ng reaksyon sa mga tinuran ni Dr. Al? Si Miss May Mohika, may tumataas ng kamay.
Magandang umaga po, no? So, May Mohika po from La Salle University, Las Marinas. Naririnig po ba ako?
Oo, naririnig, May.
Okay, pasensya na po, hindi pa ako makapag-open cam. Unang-una po, maraming salamat po sa ating mga taga-panayam dahil sa mga makabuluhang pagtalakay doon sa mga pag-aaral na nagpapatunay ng potensyal ng ating MTB ng mga mother tongue para sa pagkatuto ng ating mga mag-aaral. Ako po ay nagkaroon din ng pagkakataon na makapag-evaluate ng mga material panturo sa DepEd. At isa po sa aking mga nabasa noon ay ang math. Yun po yung panahon na bumubuo ng mga material para sa MTB, kung kaya yung math book na kanilang binuo ay ini-evaluate po namin kung tama ang paggamit ng lengguwahe, kung umaayon yung mga laman nito sa pangangailangan halimbawa ng Region 4A. Mula po doon sa karanasan na yon, ang isang nakalulungkot na katotohanan ay ang mindset ng mga taong nandun sa pag-e-evaluate, nandun sa pagbuo ng mga material na ito. Sapagkat nung una po'y ang nabasa po namin ay puro Taglish. Kumbaga, yung halimbawa, kahit simpleng addition, ginagamit pa rin nila yung addition, kahit na po pwede namang pagdaragdag. So yun po yung mga nakikita. Kumbaga yung mga yung mga terms na ginagamit ay pwede mo namang isalin sa Filipino pero na pinananatili nila yung terminong multiplication, addition and subtraction and so on. Kung bakit ko nasabing mindset, kasi nung isinalin po namin ito as evaluator, ang ini-insist nila is panatilihin yung addition, multiplication and so and so. Kasi mahirap daw sa mga bata na i-introduce yung pagdaragdag, pagbabawas, pagpaparami, and etc. Pero ang sagot ko po kasi, ang pag-iisip ninyo ma'am sa ganitong punto ay kayo bilang guro. Mahirap para sa inyo na nasanay sa wikang Ingles na inaral yung math, na nasanay sa wikang Ingles ang gamit. Subalit, ito pong ating material ay pang grade 1, pang grade 2, pang grade 3. So, siguro isa po sa makatutulong para mas maging malakas yung MTB ay i-introduce natin sa kanila yung konsepto ng pagbabawas, pagpaparami, and etc. Pero hindi sa punto de vista ng teacher na magtuturo kasi mahihirapan din daw sa pagpapaliwanag, and etc. So, isa po, paano po kaya yun? Kasi maganda, makatotohanan na talagang makabuluhan, kapakipakinabang ang mother tongue. Pero ang problema ay yung mindsetting natin. So nandun pa rin nakakulong tayo sa pag-iisip na hindi kaya at walang potential yung wika natin para dito sa mga ganitong klase ng mga content area. So siguro po, ano po kaya ang pwedeng maisulong halimbawa sa kagawaran ng edukasyon para mabago ang ganitong mindsetting ng ating mga teachers at the same time yung mga nandoon sa higher admin na bumubuo ng mga material na ito. Kasi sa experience ko nga po, nagtuturo po ako ng Filipino kaya isinusulong ko si Filipino pero itong mismong nasa content area ay walang hindi nila nakikita yung Filipino sa ganung sa area nila. So paano po kaya yun? Salamat po.
Salamat din. May nagtataas po ng kamay si Dr. Fortune.
Yeah, gusto ko lang mag-react sa sinabi ni May, Hindi ang teacher ang gagawa ng mga termino na gagamitin sa kanyang larang, Kailangan magkaisa ang mga scientists, sa math, sa chemistry o kung ano ang dapat gamitin. Sa ngayon, nag-aaway-away pa. Ang iba, sasabihin, dapat English. Ang gamitin natin sa pagtuturo ng chemistry o physics. Ang iba, gusto magturo sa wikang Filipino. Sa madaling salita, hindi pa nagkakaisa ang mga scientists. Wala tayong nandidinig sa DOST tungkol sa paggamit ng Filipino sa mga diskursong pag-agham. Kaya dahil doon, walang mga katawagan na nabubuo at lumilitaw. Well, mula sa Komisyon ng Wikang Pilipino, ang sinasabi nila ay gamitin ang mga wikang Ingles, ang Ingles, para sa mga termino na mula tayo sa Filipino. Well, para sa akin, unang stage pa lang yun, Dahil kung tuloy-tuloy natin gagamitin, mag-e-evolve ang mga salita. Ang problema natin ngayon, nag-uumpisa pa lang tayo, marami na humahadlang, hinaharang. Kaya hindi tayo aabante. Kailangan magkaisa ang mga scientists sa biology para bumuo ng mga salita o kailangan mag-agree sila kung anong salitang gagamitin. Para sa chemistry, ganun din sa physics, etc. Hindi ang isang teacher na nagsusulat ng libro ang magdidetermine ito. Well, kung mapapansin nyo sa aking pagsalita, halo, dahil ito ang kinagusto natin. Well, ang nakikita ko lang ang importante ay na ihahatid ko yung nasa isip. Pero kung tuloy-tuloy natin gagamitan ng Filipino, no? Magiging puro ito. Mag-evolve ito. Pero kung sasabihin natin, mali ito ngayon at huwag nang gamitin, wala tayong pupuntahan. Yun lang. Salamat naman.
Si Alan yata may gustong sabihin, Mar.
Gusto ko rin mag-react kay May, no? I think what May's question highlights is even those in the community that's trying to nurture MTB-MLE, we can see how language can be a very divisive issue. So, yung sinasabi ni May na mindset, dapat siguro ma-appreciate natin na meron sigurong mga assumption yung tinatawag niyang mindset kung bakit may gustong panatilihing mga words or terminologies. Posible dahil gustong i-bridge sa global literature in mathematics, materials. So, kumbaga, tayo na mga kasama dito sa reforma, let's keep an open mind and let's not use language to further divide us in this movement. Because, yun nga, sabi ni Dr. Fortune, merong mga opisina like KWF, meron silang posisyon tungkol sa paano lilinangin ang mga terminolohiya sa Agham at siyensya at matematika, pero hindi lahat sumasang-ayon doon. Si May nga ng taga Departamento ng Filipino, meron siyang ibang pananaw doon, no? So tayo na nandito sa MTB-MLE reform, kung pwede, wag tayong magsara ng mga isipan sa possibilities. Language is alive. All languages are alive. So there is no right or wrong when it comes to using language. You know, and what Dr. Giovanni shared earlier is when you go to the ground, when you don't go to the communities, walang right or wrong eh. I think ang importante sa science teachers, ano yung naiintindihan, no? From the point of view of math, kaya tawagin mo siyang addition o pagdagdag, I think ultimately ang importante, makapag-add siya. No? Magawa niya yung operation at magamit niya yung operation sa higher level problem solving. No? So again, my point is, language is so ideological that those of us in the reform, let's not use language to further divide us and try to keep an open mind and appreciate, as May said, it's about the students learning. Okay, so let's also try to keep that open mind about each other's positions.
Dayan, you want to say something? Dayan?
Yeah, just to say that I agree totally that we have to be open-minded and we have to realize that this is a steep learning curve for everyone, not just the teachers, but for everyone. Nobody has done this before for long periods of time. The research studies that Greg shared are a long time ago. So we're all learning together. Nobody has the answer. It is developmental, as Alan said as well. We have to allow time and experimentation to figure out how to do this. And
naputol si Dayan. Okay. Si Sir Al? Sir Al?
Yeah, Rick, I just want to get everyone to be at least oriented in the way we approach the use of technology. Kasi sa amin, I used to have a company for developing medical devices, and we always start with the user need. Ano ba yung pangangailangan natin dito ngayon sa bansa natin? Sinabi ko nga sa inyo, yung dalawang pinakamalaking problema ay yung growth stunting, mga bata, pandak at pulpul. Pangalawa, learning poverty, hindi makapagbasa. 10 taon, siyam, hindi marunong makaintindi. So sa akin, kung paano natin gagamitin tong MTBE as a tool or technology or a process or a research in order to address these types of problems. Kasi kung lumalabas, multilingual ang magandang silver bullet para sa growth-stunted children by using their mother tongue, let's do that. Why don't we fund the research in that area to show that it's an antidote towards getting an antidote due to the growth retardation. That's number one. And then, so it always starts, guys, with Kasi we use the 5-step process of design thinking, which we used in 1997 for developing medical devices. It always starts with the user need. We design our input. Ano bang gagawin natin? Then let's measure the initial output of that experiment. Then we verify if it's applicable. And then we validate in other locations. Very simple 5-step process that I've been always instructing all scientists with all their billion-peso research in the Philippines. So I'm thinking of applying the same methodology in education and especially in this particular area. So I'm all here to hear you. You guys are the experts, not me. I'm just very oriented with the process about the utilization of technology to have a much bigger impact and eventually to make it sustainable with the support of everyone, not only government, not only DOST. My foundation on education and STEM, definitely we can provide funds on that. There's 6 billion pesos available from League of Corporate Foundations to support education. We can obviously address that issue if we can connect it with a societal problem like road stunting. Our being last placers in STEM and PISA is another one that we had the STEM B as one of the programs, but I think that problem can be solved also by the language issue. So I think let's not get hung up on the mindset in a sense, but rather direct our efforts towards solving the problems that are facing us after this post-pandemic era, which is really a big learning gap and a big learning poverty. Yun lang. Thank you. But I'm here listening again. Thank you.
Salamat.
Si Mar? Naputol
Si
kasi
Dr. Rod. Si
Yes.
Dr. Rod, I was trying to say something.
Sandali lang daw kasi dami ko nang sinulat, and then I agree with most of the opinion and all the materials given to us by our speakers and all the people who have spoken. What I want to emphasize is that really education is a problem in the country, from elementary to even the college and postdoc level. Now, the NAS is moving around the country. We have been meeting the different regions, no? And the different regions, I'm referring to the regional research and development and innovation councils. Ang ano talaga nila is we need materials in the Filipino language. In fact, yung pagtanaw na pinapakita namin na common goals for everyone, education and all the aspects of development, gusto nila i-translate into Filipino. Now, ang wikang pambansa, ang komisyon ng wikang pambansa ay tumutulong. Uunahin daw nila ang executive summary. Pero yung iba, kailangan namin ng tulong para matulungan natin ang komisyon ng wikang pambansa, i-translate siya into Filipino. That's why when I talk to the UP system and all the other HEIs, I was telling them. Ngayon, ibig ko rin i-emphasize yung sinabi ni Al, ni-emphasize din namin sa NAS na kailangan natin tulungan ang mga batang nag-quit at saka nandyan sa system na, how do you call this, kulang sa nutrisyon. Talagang, yung iba siguro hindi maintindihan dahil hindi nag-almusal and marami pang dahilan. So, yun lang. Napakahaba na ng mga sinabi ko kaya wala tayong oras. Maraming salamat.
Mar, naputol si Dayan kanina. Baka pwede nating tawagin ulit. Tapos pagkatapos doon si Ma'am May Lim. Okay?
Okay.
Dayan?
No need to add anymore. That must have been God's cutoff for telling me to be quiet.
Okay. Okay. Ma'am May?
Yes, good morning po. Maraming salamat sa lahat ng speakers. Ang dami rin ako natutunan. Gusto ko lang in-note yung may nagtanong kasi sa akin dati na do you think in English or in Filipino? Tapos nung tinanong niya sa akin, napaisip din ako, oo nga no. Importante pala yon kasi iba yung order minsan pa nagsusulat ka inisip mo in English, tapos sinulat mo sa Filipino, iba yung order iba yung grammar mo. And so, it actually goes beyond in English or in Filipino or in what other language. Nagpa-persist din siya. Do you think in Excel? Do you think in PowerPoint? Or do you think in Python? So parang minsan napapansin ko rin yun, yung code switching is something that's real, na iba yung lumalabas na sinasabi. kapag iba yung way, iba yung thinking mo, tas iba yung language kung saan mo siya ina-express. So sana magandang makwento rin siguro yon in the future kung sino yung nagre-research. Thank you.
Ma'am May, actually ang sabi nga ni Bonifacio Sibayan, ang de facto national language of the Philippines ay Taglish. No? Okay. Si Greg kanina pa, may sasabihin ka ba, Greg? Kasi nakita ko yung kamay mo tapos bumaba yung kamay. Anong...
Marami akong gustong sabihin pero hindi, magre-react lang ako. No? Unang-una dun sa yung sinasabi ni Al na social-emotional aspect. Actually, imaginein lang natin, kung kalahati lang ang naiintindihan mo sa sinasabi ng teacher mo, ano mararamdaman mo? Masisiyahan ka ba sa classroom nun? Alam mo, pagalitan ka ng teacher, papahiyain ka ng mga kaklase mo, pagtatawanan ka nila, papagalitan ka ng magulang mo. This is the reason, I think. Ito ang dahilan kung bakit ang taas ng bullying sa Philippine schools. Ang karamihan ng mga estudyante natin nakakulong sa isang classroom ng ilang oras na tinitiis nila yung ganong sitwasyon. Boredom, syempre, no? Wala ka naintindihan eh. At hindi lang yun, yung takot na mapagtawanan, mapagalitan. Kaya talagang napakahalaga nung yung aspetong yun.
Oo. Ched at saka si Alan. Sige.
Okay. Napaka-yaman yung ating discussion. Ang dahil ko rin natutunan. Salamat sa nag-organisa. Sana maging series ito. Galing ako sa College of Education ng UP. At talagang concern namin ang teacher education sa bansa. At ang nakita namin ng isang rason bakit ganoon ang stat o condition ng mga teacher ay talagang kulang ang pag-uusap ng mga scientists, mga social scientists sa mga teachers. Kaya parang kami-kami lang. Mga teachers sila lang. Kaya very focused sa methods. Hindi nag-iisip, analytic masyado, ganyan. So I hope that you would engage with our teachers, with our teacher educators. At sana ay tama lang na sana ay ma-intellectualize ng ating mga wika para sa mga PISA in the future, teams, CPLM ay magagamit ng ating mga wika. Yun lang po.
Okay. Salamat, Ched. Alan?
Mabilis lang, no? Just a rejoinder to what Greg and Al have been highlighting. If we look at the PISA data, we saw that some good pedagogical principles, for example, teacher activities that engage the student, require responses, what Diane mentioned as different levels of elicitation. If you look at the Philippine PISA data, those are actually strongly predictive of poor performance in the various areas. Why? Because those elicitation techniques, those supposedly good pedagogical practices are done in English. So when you ask me, instead of engaging, I feel threatened. So I would rather not engage you. So this is when good pedagogy done in the wrong language has a very negative side effect on the social-emotional experiences of the children. In one interaction with Greg, I did say that the reason why the Philippines participated in PISA is to use the data to get insights into what we can do better. Sadly, the data are just there, and we're just feeling bad about the results, but not trying to get insights. We're not even using the data in an insightful way, and instead we kind of point fingers into who's at fault. But there are insights there that converge with the literature that we can use to try to make things a little bit better.
Okay. Bani, may sasabihin ka yata. Bani? Dr. Malapit?
Hello po. Maigi sana na may mga researchers talaga na pupunta sa grounds. Kasi maiging matanong natin kung talagang kailangan nila yung tulong natin. Kailangan bang gamitin yung mother tongue nila or purely or multilingual, bilingual, and so on. Para at least meron tayong starting point. Kasi pag gagawa lang tayo ng gagawa and hindi pala nila kailangan, baka sayang yung efforts. So kasi nung una gumawa ako ng module and then present ko sa Mountain Province, sa Sagada, and parang mas maganda sana kung sa sarili naming language, sabi nila. So instead na sa Ilocano, kasi naniniwala ako na yung lingua franca kasi sa Norte, Ilocano, so mas maraming makikinabang. Pero may mga lugar na mas gusto yung sarili nila na language, and I think training yung kailangan nila. So dapat ang i-design natin kung paano, kumbaga guide kung paano natin sila matutulungan. Instead na we just tayo-tayo lang dito nag-uusap, yung stakeholders hindi kasama. So we should involve the stakeholders. You should know kung ano talaga yung problems nila, ano yung kailangan, and so on. And then lalabas from there na una, budget. Kasi wala silang paano sila gagawa ng modules. Pangalawa, sino ang expert talaga sa specific subjects na tutulong gagawa ng module. And then pangatlo, teacher training, sino magte-train sa kanila. So I think kailangan nating pumunta sa kanila.
Gusto niyong nalaman namin na si Dr. Malapit ay gumawa rin ng dictionary ng siyensya sa Ilocano. Tama ba 'yon?
Hindi pa po tapos.
Hindi pa tapos.
Hindi pa tapos. Next year pa in collaboration with an Ilocano expert.
Okay.
Kasi di rin ako masyadong marunong sa sarili kong mother tongue.
Okay. Si Greg?
Naalala ko din yung isa ko pang gustong sabihin, Ricky. Yung gusto ko naman i-connecta dun sa sinabi ni Rod Asanza, no, tungkol dun sa pagdadala ng ating mga natutuklasan ng mga siyentista at mananaliksik sa no, sa mga probinsya, no. Nagpunta ako minsan, kasama ko si National Scientist Cruise, nagpunta kami sa Bataan, ano, at tulad ng alam nyo, marami siyang ginagawa ron. Nakausap ko yung isang contact niya at ang sabi sa akin, kapag dinidiscuss daw ng LGU yung disaster risk and mitigation procedures, Ingles ang ginagamit.
Hindi maintindihan.
Hindi maintindihan. Nagulat ako, parang napaka-obvious, no, na dapat maintindihan ng mga tao. And yet, ganun yung no? Kaya ganun yung nangyayari. Kaya napakahalaga talaga nung binanggit ni Alan na parang ang key really is no? Parang pakikinggan mo yung pangangailangan. No? Sinabi rin ito ni Gio. Pakikinggan mo yung pangangailangan ng estudyante, nung mga kausap mo tungkol sa DRR, no? At ang pangunahing binibigyan natin ng pansin yung pagkakaunawaan, pagkakaintindihan para nang sa ganun mas epektibo yung mga ginagawa natin.
Isang rejoinder lang sa sinabi mo, na-stimulate mo ko, papayagan ba ako?
Yeah, Ma'am Rod.
Okay, kasi marami kami ASEAN projects, no? So, lumilibot kami sa buong ASEAN. Pag binibigay namin in English, agad din-translate nila sa language nila. Okay? So, pagpunta namin sa Malaysia, translate. Thailand, translate. So, ganun, nagiging effective kaagad. So, even if they were talking to the LGUs, to the HEIs and so on, tina-translate kaagad. So, let us look into this process of communicating, lalo na sa mga importanteng topics. Maraming salamat.
Alan?
I will just push it one step further. No? Sabi nga ni Dr. Giovanni, papakinggan natin. Pero I think kasama din, kailangan nating i-advocate ang less surveillance and control from the central. Kasi katulad nung sinabi ni Diane, no? Sabi nung isang principal, this is illegal. We will not be allowed by DepEd. No? So maraming teacher na ang lakas ng malasakit. They have intuitions about what will work, but they don't feel empowered to try out things that will help their children. So we bring it to the ground, but at the same time, at a different level, there should be advocacy that will help our education policymakers understand the teacher autonomy and principal autonomy are very important factors to realize school reform. at the end of the day, they will tell us, hindi kami papayagan. No, they will tell us we will not be allowed. The superintendent will reprimand me. The regional director will withhold my teacher development funds. So kung merong mindset na kailangan palitan, yun siguro. It's a mindset of controlling teachers because the idea is you have to do it one way, otherwise you're not doing it right. So that's a bigger advocacy that we will have to deal with. And the mother tongue is just one of those things that are kind of victimized by this one-size-fits-all mandate and the control regime in educational reform.
Okay. Mar, time check lang, 11:20 na rito. Ano kaya?
Oo, isa pang komento mula kay Al. And siguro i-ano na natin. Kulang na kulang talaga ang oras, pero asahan po nyo hindi ito ang huling pag-uusap natin. Al?
But just wanted to end on a high note, guys, na may proseso. Hindi naman sarado, Alan, no? Like our implementation for socio-emotional learning, training for actually STEM teachers in ALS, alternative learning system, yung mga training namin. And it's funded by UNICEF. So the formula to me has always been do a pilot to demonstrate with a little bit of a bus-bus, like our National STEM Bee program, binasbasan ni USEC DADS San Antonio ng curriculum development ng DepEd, tumuloy. But we were not asking them for any money. No support, all private sector. Kailangan ganun dapat eh. Walang gastos ng gobyerno, tayo lahat ang gagastos, tayo magdadala ng module, tayo magtuturo, tayo mag-implement, papakita natin sa kanila yung resulta. Essentially, a feasibility testing. And this is the kind of thing that I want everyone to think about. But it always starts with a user need. Kung may nakita kayong pangangailangan, kailangan nating address, gawa tayo ng proposal, gawa tayo ng proseso, maybe I can look for funds for it to be piloted, and then we go ahead. Like what I was telling Greg, socio-emotional learning ba yan? Dayan, can we do that on the grade 1 to 3 in Lubuagan if you want? Just show that all of your students in Lubuagan are socially, emotionally balanced, and they don't have any mental issues, and it should be the way to go. So things like that, guys. So, but I think there's a program, so let's continue this discussion. And definitely, I'm willing to be part of this educational team using language to be able to address our issues. Salamat.
Okay.
Maraming salamat, Al. With that note, Ricky, tatapusin na natin ang ating napakayaman, napakalalim na pag-uusap. As I've said, hindi po ito ang huli. Si Al po ay naboto na director ng PAASE. So makaasa po kayo na full support tayo sa pagsusulong ng ating mga ideya. Kung magkakaroon tayo ng serye batay sa mga lumabas ngayon, actually nakikita ko kahit yung 6 na puntos ni Alan, pwedeng bawat isa doon magkaroon tayo ng deeper dive, di ba? At tamang-tama po, very timely ang PAASE po ay magkakaroon ng monthly meeting with DOST Secretary and other DOST officers simula sa January. At ipapasok po natin ang usapin ito, i-transcribe at atin pong i-organisa ang pag-uusap natin ngayon para ito'y nasa isang lugar at maaaring ma-access ng mga interesadong bumasa at interesadong sumali dito sa ating talakayan. At ang isa pa yung projectizing, our ideas and our ideals. So mahalaga tulad ng sinabi ni Al, patuloy po tayong mag-usap at patuloy po tayong bukas po kami sa mga inyong rekomendasyon, suggestion tungkol sa mga paksang pwede nating pag-usapan moving forward. Maraming salamat, Greg, Dayan, Sir Fortune, Alan, Gio. Maraming pong salamat at hanggang sa muli at magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Inabot na tayo ng 3 oras. Salamat po. Pwede po bang mag-picture tayo?
Tama, picture pala.
Sayang.
Sige po. Pwede po po
Pakibukas ng inyong mga camera.
Ayan. Page 1 po. Okay, 1, 2, 3, smile. Page 2 po. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay na po.
Salamat po.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Salamat, PAASE.
Thank you. Salamat, Alan. Salamat po sa lahat.
Sige, salamat.
Greg, salamat. Ricky.
Salamat.
Gio, Dayan, and everyone else. Salamat po.